Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. It was a cold, dark evening when the order came in. I worked at a small, family-owned restaurant that specialized in home-cooked meals, and tonight I was on delivery duty. The address was unfamiliar, located on the outskirts of town, where houses were spread far apart and the streets were poorly lit. I grabbed the food, checked the address again, and set off in my old car. The drive was uneventful at first. The further I got from the town center, the quieter it became. Soon, the streetlights disappeared, and I relied on my headlights to cut through the darkness. After about 20 minutes, I turned onto a narrow, gravel road that led even deeper into the countryside. Tall trees lined the path, their branches creating eerie shapes in the dim light. Finally, I reached the house. It was an old, two-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. The windows were dark, and the only light came from a single bulb above the front door. I parked my car, grabbed the food, and walked up to the door. As I approached, a feeling of unease settled in my stomach. I knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. A man stood there, staring at me with an intense expression. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. His eyes were hard, and his mouth was set in a grim line. "Delivery from the restaurant," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. As soon as I crossed the threshold, he shut the door behind me with a loud thud, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He led me into the living room, which was sparsely furnished and dimly lit. The air was thick with tension. "Wait here," he said, his voice low and rough. He disappeared into another room, and I stood there, clutching the bag of food, feeling increasingly uneasy. Minutes passed, and the man didn't return. I started to get nervous. I set the food down on a dusty table and glanced around the room. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and there was an oppressive silence in the air. Something didn't feel right. I decided to call out. "Sir, your food's getting cold." There was no response. I took a tentative step towards the doorway he had disappeared through. Just as I was about to call out again, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the man standing there, holding a gun. "Sit down," he said, his voice cold and menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly lowered myself onto the couch. He kept the gun pointed at me, his eyes boring into mine. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. I shook my head, my mind racing. "No, I don't." He sneered. "Your boss. He ruined my life. And now you're going to help me get back at him." He started pacing, still holding the gun. He ranted about how the restaurant owner had cheated him, driven him to bankruptcy, and destroyed his family. His words were filled with anger and bitterness. I tried to stay calm, but fear was clawing at me from the inside. I needed to find a way out, but he was unpredictable and armed. I glanced around the room, looking for anything that might help me. He noticed. "Don't even think about trying anything," he warned, waving the gun for emphasis. "You're not leaving here until I've had my revenge." I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "Look, I just deliver the food. I don't know anything about what happened between you and my boss. But maybe we can figure something out." He shook his head, his grip on the gun tightening. "No. You're just a pawn. But your boss, he'll pay for what he did." He continued pacing, muttering to himself. I knew I had to act fast. I noticed a heavy lamp on the side table within reach. It was my only chance. I waited for him to turn his back, then lunged for the lamp and swung it at him with all my strength. The lamp connected with his head, and he staggered, dropping the gun. I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I grabbed the gun and ran for the door, my heart racing. I fumbled with the lock, my hands shaking, but finally managed to get it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were trembling so badly it took 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. I started the car and sped down the driveway, gravel flying behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man stumble out onto the porch, clutching his head. I drove back to town as fast as I could, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. When I reached the restaurant, I called the police and told them everything. They arrived quickly and went out to the house. They found the man still there, disoriented and bleeding from the head wound. He was arrested and taken into custody. It was only then that I allowed myself to break down, the full weight of what had happened hitting me. I was safe, but the fear and tension of those moments stayed with me long after. I was driving through the national park late at night. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to close in, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the darkness. It had been a long day, and I was eager to get to my cabin. The winding roads were deserted, and the sense of isolation was palpable. Around a bend, I saw a figure standing by the roadside, thumb outstretched. It was rare to see hitchhikers out here, especially at this hour. The man looked disheveled, his clothes dirty and torn. I hesitated, but something made me slow down and pull over. Maybe it was the remoteness of the place or the thought of someone in need. As he approached, I noticed his wild eyes and the nervous energy about him. "Thanks, man. I've been out here for hours," he said, climbing into the passenger seat. His voice was rough, and he smelled of sweat and earth. I nodded, trying to mask my unease. "Where are you headed?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Just a bit further up," he replied vaguely, glancing around the interior of the car. "Been walking for a long time." I tried to make small talk, but he was evasive. His answers were short, and he kept fidgeting with his hands. There was something off about him, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The atmosphere in the car grew tense as the silence stretched on. After a few miles, he started asking odd questions. "You out here alone?" he asked, his eyes flicking towards me. "Yeah, just me," I said, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. His presence was making me increasingly uncomfortable. I needed to find a way to get him out of the car without provoking him. We drove on in silence for a few more minutes before he spoke again. "Pull over up here," he said suddenly. "I need to get out." Relieved, I did as he asked. But as I slowed down, he lunged towards me, grabbing the steering wheel and forcing the car off the road. We skidded to a halt, and I felt a surge of panic. "What are you doing?" I shouted, trying to wrestle control of the car back. He didn't answer, his eyes wild and desperate. "Get out," he demanded, pulling something from his jacket. It was a knife, its blade catching the faint light from the dashboard. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized the danger I was in. I slowly raised my hands, trying to stay calm. "All right, take it easy," I said, my mind racing. I needed to find a way out of this situation without getting hurt. He motioned for me to get out of the car, and I complied, my eyes never leaving the knife. Once we were both outside, he shoved me towards the front of the car, keeping the knife pointed at me. "Give me your keys," he said, his voice low and threatening. I reached into my pocket and handed them over, my mind scrambling for a plan. He turned to get into the driver's seat, and I saw my chance. I took a step back, then another, before turning and running into the woods. The darkness swallowed me up, and I stumbled over roots and branches, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't stop. I needed to put as much distance between us as possible. The forest was dense, and I used it to my advantage, weaving through the trees and hoping he would lose track of me. After what felt like hours, I finally stopped, my lungs burning and my legs trembling. I listened intently, but all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. He was nowhere in sight. I knew I couldn't stay here. I needed to find help, but I had no idea where I was. My car and phone were back on the road, and I had no way to call for help. I took a deep breath and started walking, hoping I was heading in the right direction. The forest seemed endless, and every snap of a twig made me jump. I kept moving, driven by the fear that he might still be out there, looking for me. The adrenaline was wearing off, and I was starting to feel the exhaustion from the night's events. Finally, I saw a faint light through the trees. I hurried towards it, praying it was a campsite or a ranger station. As I got closer, I realized it was a small cabin, its windows glowing softly in the darkness. Relief washed over me, and I approached cautiously, knocking on the door. An older man opened it, his face edged with concern. "What happened to you?" he asked, ushering me inside. I quickly explained what had happened, and he nodded grimly. "We need to call the Rangers," he said, picking up a radio. I sank into a chair, my body shaking with exhaustion and relief. The Rangers arrived soon after, and I recounted my story again. They assured me they would find the man and took me back to the main road. My car was still there, but the hitchhiker was long gone. As I drove away with the Rangers, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in the Rocky Mountains. I needed a break from the constant buzz of city life. The idea of solitude in nature was appealing, and I found a remote spot that promised tranquility. The first day was perfect. I set up my tent near a small stream and spent the afternoon exploring the surroundings. The crisp mountain air was refreshing, and the scenery was breathtaking. As the sun set, I started a campfire and cooked a simple meal, feeling content and at peace. Night fell, and the stars lit up the sky. I settled into my tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The rustling leaves and distant animal calls were a soothing backdrop as I drifted off to sleep. But in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a strange sound. It was a soft, steady crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. The footsteps grew closer, then stopped. I held my breath, my mind racing. Who could be out here at this hour? I peered out of my tent but saw nothing. The forest was dark and silent. I tried to shake off the unease and went back to sleep, convincing myself it was just an animal passing by. But the next day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As I explored the area, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me. I kept looking over my shoulder, but there was no one there. The isolation that had seemed so appealing now felt threatening. I decided to stay close to my camp for the rest of the day. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they circled my camp, slow and deliberate. I lay in my tent, paralyzed with fear. The sounds were too heavy to be an animal. Someone was out there, and they were stalking me. Morning brought a grim realization. I found fresh footprints around my camp, large and unmistakably human. Panic set in. I needed to leave, but the nearest ranger station was miles away. I packed up my things, deciding to make a run for it. As I walked, I kept glancing behind me, the feeling of being followed growing stronger. The forest seemed to close in around me, every sound amplified by my fear. I quickened my pace, trying to stay calm and think clearly. Then I saw him. A man, dressed in camouflage, standing a few hundred yards away. He was watching me, a rifle slung over his shoulder. My heart raced as I ducked behind a tree, trying to stay out of sight. Who was he, and why was he following me? I had no choice but to keep moving, staying off the main trails and trying to lose him in the dense forest. I moved as quietly as I could, my senses on high alert. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I knew I couldn't keep this up for long. Hours passed, and I was exhausted. I needed to find a place to hide and come up with a plan. I found a small cave, just big enough to crawl into. I squeezed inside, my body trembling with fear and fatigue. The cave was dark and damp, but it felt safer than being out in the open. I sat in the darkness, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. I had to signal for help, but my phone had no reception out here. I remembered the emergency whistle in my pack and pulled it out, hoping the sound would carry. Taking a deep breath, I blew the whistle as loud as I could. The shrill sound pierced the silence, echoing through the trees. I waited, my heart pounding. There was no response. I blew it again and again, praying someone would hear. Minutes felt like hours as I waited. Then, faintly, I heard voices. Relief washed over me as I crawled out of the cave and blew the whistle again. The voices grew closer, and I saw flashlights cutting through the darkness. A group of hikers appeared, their faces a mix of confusion and concern. I stumbled towards them, my voice shaking as I explained what had happened. They quickly formed a protective circle around me and led me back to their campsite. Once there, they radioed for help, and a park ranger arrived soon after. I recounted my ordeal, and the ranger promised to investigate. They escorted me back to the nearest station, where I finally felt safe. The next day, the ranger informed me that they had found no trace of the man. He had vanished into the forest, leaving no clues behind. The experience left me shaken, but grateful to be alive. I was working the night shift at the gas station, as usual. The nights were long and quiet, with only the occasional customer stopping by to fill up or grab a snack. I was used to the solitude, finding comfort in the routine. That night started no differently. I was stocking shelves and cleaning up, lost in my thoughts, when the bell above the door jingled. A man walked in, his hood pulled up and his hands shoved deep in his pockets. Something about him made me uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. He wandered the aisles for a few minutes, seemingly aimless. Then he approached the counter, and I saw the glint of a gun. "Empty the register," he said, his voice low and menacing. My heart skipped a beat, but I kept my face neutral, trying to stay calm. I nodded and slowly opened the register, my hands shaking slightly. I knew I had to play it cool. He waved the gun, motioning for me to hurry up. I started pulling out the cash, trying to think of a way to alert the authorities. The gas station had a silent alarm button under the counter, but I couldn't reach it without him noticing. As I handed him the money, I glanced around, looking for anything that might help me. The security cameras were rolling, but I knew it could be hours before anyone reviewed the footage. I needed a plan, and fast. The man was getting agitated, his eyes darting around nervously. "Come on, faster," he snapped. I forced myself to move slowly, buying time. My mind raced, searching for a way out of this situation. Then I remembered my phone, tucked away in my pocket. If I could just find a way to use it without him seeing, I might be able to call for help. But how? He was watching my every move. I took a deep breath and decided to take a risk. "Look, man, there's more money in the safe in the back," I lied, hoping to distract him. His eyes narrowed, but he seemed to consider it. "Show me," he demanded. I led him towards the back room, trying to think of a way to get to my phone. As we walked, I subtly pulled it out and slipped it into my hand, keeping it hidden. The back room was cramped, with shelves of supplies and a small safe in the corner. "The combination's on a note in the drawer," I said, pointing to a desk. He moved towards it, and I seized the moment. I quickly dialed 911 and hit send, praying the dispatcher would hear something useful. "Where's the note?" he barked, growing more impatient. I pretended to search, stalling for time. "It should be right here," I said, fumbling with the drawer. I needed to keep him talking. "Just hurry up," he growled, waving the gun. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to stay focused. "It's here somewhere," I mumbled, dragging out the search. I hoped the dispatcher had picked up by now and was sending help. Suddenly, the man's patience snapped. "Forget it," he snarled. "We're going back to the front." He grabbed my arm, dragging me out of the back room. I clutched my phone, hoping the call was still connected. As we reached the counter, I saw headlights pull into the parking lot. My heart leapt with hope. Maybe it was a customer, or better yet, the police. I had to keep the robber distracted a little longer. "Please, just let me go," I pleaded, trying to keep his attention on me. He glared at me, his grip tightening on the gun. "Shut up," he said, his voice cold. But I saw his eyes flick towards the door, uneasy. The bell above the door jingled again, and a man walked in. He looked around, sensing the tension. "Is everything okay here?" he asked, his eyes on the robber. The robber tensed, his finger twitching on the trigger. "Stay out of this," the robber warned, pointing the gun at the newcomer. The man raised his hands, backing away slowly. But his presence seemed to unsettle the robber, making him more anxious. I saw my chance. While the robber's attention was divided, I discreetly hit the silent alarm button under the counter. It sent a signal directly to the police, and I hoped they would arrive soon. The robber turned back to me, his eyes wild. "What did you do?" he demanded, his voice rising. "Nothing, I swear," I said, trying to sound convincing. But he didn't believe me. He grabbed me by the collar, pulling me close. "If the cops show up, you're dead," he hissed. I nodded, swallowing hard. I needed to keep him calm until help arrived. "Just take the money and go," I said, my voice trembling. "No one needs to get hurt." He seemed to consider it, his grip loosening slightly. But then we heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. The robber's eyes widened in panic. He shoved me away, turning towards the door. "Don't move," he warned, backing out of the store. The sirens were getting closer, and I knew the police would be here any second. I stayed still, watching as he darted out into the night. The police arrived moments later, their lights flashing. I rushed outside, pointing in the direction the robber had fled. They took off after him, and I slumped against the wall, my legs shaking. It was over. I was safe. The police soon returned, informing me they had caught the robber a few blocks away. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, knowing he wouldn't be able to hurt anyone else. The officers took my statement, and I explained everything that had happened. They praised me for staying calm and acting smart, but all I felt was exhaustion. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving me drained. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that had gripped me. The gas station felt different now, more sinister. I knew it would take time to feel safe there again. In the days that followed, I kept replaying the events in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. But I knew I had done my best in a terrifying situation. I had survived, and that was what mattered. I decided to take some time off work, needing a break to recover from the ordeal. The thought of returning to the night shift made my stomach churn. I needed to regain my sense of security. As I reflected on the experience, I realized how quickly things could change. One moment, everything was normal, and the next, my life was in danger. It was a sobering reminder of how fragile safety could be. I took comfort in knowing that I had stayed calm and found a way to alert the authorities. It wasn't easy, but I had done it. And that gave me the strength to move forward, one day at a time. The storm hit harder than I expected. I was alone on my small sailboat, trying to navigate through the relentless waves and howling wind. The sea was a dark, angry beast that night, and I fought to keep control as the storm tossed my boat like a toy. Then, out of nowhere, the engine sputtered and died. My heart sank as I realized I was stranded, and the only option was to ride out the storm and hope for the best. As the first light of dawn broke through the storm clouds, I spotted land in the distance. An island. Relief washed over me, thinking I could find shelter and perhaps get help. I steered the boat towards the shore, struggling with the damaged sails and oars. It took hours, but I finally made it to the beach, exhausted and soaked to the bone. The island seemed deserted. I pulled the boat up onto the sand and looked around, trying to get my bearings. The place was eerie, with dense forest and rocky cliffs. There was no sign of civilization, no sounds of birds or animals. Just a steady, unsettling silence. I decided to explore and find some kind of shelter. As I walked inland, I stumbled upon an old, overgrown path. It led me to a cluster of dilapidated buildings, possibly an abandoned settlement. The structures were crumbling and covered in vines, but I was grateful for any kind of shelter from the elements. One of the buildings, a small cabin, looked sturdier than the rest. I pushed open the door, wincing at the creaking sound. Inside, it was dark and musty, but at least it was dry. I found some old furniture, covered in dust and cobwebs. There was an old, rusted stove and a small bed with a decaying mattress. I set about making the place somewhat livable, using what little supplies I had. As night fell, the storm picked up again. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in brief, stark bursts. I sat by the window, watching the storm, feeling uneasy but grateful for the shelter. Just as I was about to try and get some sleep, I heard a noise outside. A rustling, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe an animal, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I crept to the window and peered out, straining to see through the darkness and rain. A flash of lightning revealed figures moving in the trees. Human figures. My blood ran cold. Who could be out there in this weather, on this seemingly deserted island? The figures moved closer, and I could see they were carrying torches. I ducked down, hoping they hadn't seen me. The light from the torches flickered through the cracks in the cabin walls, casting eerie shadows. I held my breath, praying they would pass by. But they didn't. The door creaked open, and a group of men entered. They looked rough and weathered, with hard eyes and menacing expressions. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, stepped forward. "Who are you, and what are you doing here?" he demanded. I tried to explain, my voice shaking. My boat got stranded in the storm. I just needed shelter for the night. The leader narrowed his eyes, clearly not convinced. "This is our island. You shouldn't be here." The threat in his voice was unmistakable. They searched the cabin, taking my supplies and throwing me to the floor. "You can't stay here," the leader said. "You'll come with us." They bound my hands and led me out into the storm, the rain stinging my skin. I had no choice but to follow, my mind racing with fear. They took me to another part of the island, where a larger, more fortified building stood. Inside, it was filled with supplies, weapons, and more men. It was clear they were a dangerous group, and I had stumbled into their territory. They threw me into a small, dark room and locked the door. Hours passed, maybe even days. I lost track of time in the darkness. The storm raged on outside, and I could hear the men talking in low voices. Occasionally, someone would bring me a small amount of food and water, but no one spoke to me. I was trapped, with no idea what they planned to do with me. One night, the door opened, and the leader entered. He sat down across from me, his expression unreadable. "We're not bad people," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. "We just can't afford to have anyone knowing about this place. It's our refuge." I begged him to let me go, promising I wouldn't tell anyone. He shook his head. "I can't take that risk. But maybe, if you prove you can be useful, we might reconsider." He left me alone again, my mind spinning with desperation. I had to find a way out. I started paying attention to the routines of my captors, looking for any weakness or opportunity. I noticed that the guards outside my room changed shifts at regular intervals. I also discovered a small, loose panel on the wall that led to a narrow crawl space. One night, when the guards were changing shifts, I made my move. I squeezed through the crawl space, holding my breath as I inched along. It led to another part of the building, and I could see an open window ahead. My heart pounded as I climbed out, dropping to the ground below. The rain had finally stopped, and the island was eerily quiet. I moved cautiously, staying in the shadows. I knew I had to get to my boat and get off the island before they discovered I was gone. But first, I needed to find some supplies. I sneaked into one of the storage buildings, grabbing food, water, and a small knife. As I made my way back towards the beach, I heard voices. They had discovered my escape and were searching for me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panic gasps. Finally, I reached the beach. My boat was still there, though it had been damaged by the storm. I pushed it into the water, praying it would hold together long enough to get me to safety. I could hear the men shouting, getting closer. I managed to get the boat into deeper water, using the oars to propel myself away from the island. The boat creaked and groaned, but it held together. I glanced back, seeing the men on the shore, their torches like angry eyes in the darkness. I rowed with all my strength, the muscles in my arms burning. The island grew smaller and smaller behind me, until it was just a dark shape on the horizon. I didn't stop until I was sure I was far enough away, then I collapsed, exhausted but relieved. As dawn broke, I spotted a fishing boat in the distance. I waved frantically, and they came to my rescue. I was safe. I told the fishermen about the storm and my ordeal on the island, but I left out the details of the dangerous men. I just wanted to be as far away from that place as possible. They took me to the nearest port, where I contacted the authorities. I didn't know what would happen to the men on the island, but I knew I had to warn others to stay away. As I stood on solid ground once more, I vowed never to venture into unknown waters alone again. I checked into the old hotel late one evening. It was a historic building with creaky floors and a grand, faded lobby. The kind of place that felt like it held 1,000 stories within its walls. I was there on business, needing a place to stay for a few nights while I attended meetings in the city. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes, handed me my key with a forced smile. As I made my way to my room on the 3rd floor, I noticed the staff seemed unusually tense. It was a quiet kind of tension, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. My room was small but comfortable, with a view of the alley behind the hotel. I unpacked my things and settled in for the night, looking forward to getting some rest after a long day. But sleep didn't come easily. There was a persistent noise from the room next door, muffled voices, followed by silence, then the sound of something heavy being moved. Curiosity got the better of me. I crept out of bed and pressed my ear to the wall. The voices were clearer now, speaking in hurried, anxious tones. I couldn't make out everything, but words like shipment and money stood out. It sounded like something more than just late-night chatter. The next morning, I decided to explore the hotel a bit. As I walked through the dimly lit hallways, I noticed several rooms with "Do Not Disturb" signs. More than usual for a hotel of this size. It seemed odd, but I didn't think much of it until I saw one of the housekeepers slipping into a room with a large duffel bag. Later that day, I saw the same housekeeper again. She was speaking with a man in a suit near the back entrance. Their conversation was tense, their gestures sharp and agitated. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but their body language told me something was off. I decided to do some digging. I struck up a conversation with the receptionist, asking innocuous questions about the hotel's history and the staff. She was friendly enough but became noticeably nervous when I mentioned the housekeepers. She quickly changed the subject, directing my attention to a framed photograph on the wall. That night, the noises next door started again. This time, I was prepared. I had my phone ready to record, hoping to capture something that might explain the strange behavior. I pressed record and listened. The voices were clearer now, talking about schedules, deliveries, and the boss. I had enough to make me uneasy, but I needed more. The next day, I spent time in the hotel's lounge, observing the comings and goings of the staff and guests. I noticed a pattern. Certain guests received special attention, escorted to their rooms by the manager himself. These guests rarely left their rooms during the day, and when they did, it was usually late at night. I decided to follow one of these guests. I waited until he left his room, then shadowed him from a distance. He met with the same man in the suit I had seen before, and they exchanged briefcases in the alley behind the hotel. My heart raced as I realized I was witnessing something illegal. I hurried back to my room, trying to process what I had seen. I needed to get out of there, but I also felt a strange compulsion to gather more evidence. I wanted to make sure the authorities would take me seriously. I spent the rest of the day collecting as much information as I could, discreetly taking photos and notes. That night, the situation escalated. I heard a commotion in the hallway and peered out to see two men dragging a third, unconscious man into one of the rooms. My blood ran cold. This was more than just illegal trade, it was dangerous. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't just walk out. I had to be careful. I packed my bags and waited until the early hours of the morning, when the hotel was at its quietest. I slipped out of my room and headed for the stairs, avoiding the elevator in case it made too much noise. As I reached the lobby, I saw the receptionist talking to the manager. They were both on edge, their eyes darting around the room. I took a deep breath and walked briskly past them, nodding politely. They barely acknowledged me, too wrapped up in their conversation. I made it to my car and drove straight to the nearest police station. I handed over all my evidence, my hands shaking. The officers listened intently, their faces growing serious as they reviewed the photos and recordings. They assured me they would investigate and advised me to find another place to stay. I spent the rest of the night in a cheap motel, unable to sleep. My mind raced with the events of the past few days, the realization of how close I had come to real danger. The next morning, I received a call from the police. They had raided the hotel and arrested several members of the staff, including the manager. My evidence had been crucial in exposing their operation. It was a quiet Thursday evening when I got the delivery order. The address was an upscale house on the outskirts of town, an area known for its sprawling lawns and impressive homes. As a part-time delivery driver, I was used to dropping off food at all kinds of places, but this one stood out. It looked more like a mansion than a house. When I arrived, I parked my car at the end of the long driveway. The house was massive, with large windows that offered glimpses of elegantly furnished rooms inside. I grabbed the bags of food and headed towards the front door. It was slightly ajar, which was unusual. Most people in this neighborhood were meticulous about security. I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I should knock or just call out. Instead, I pushed the door open a little further and stepped inside. "Hello? Your food delivery is here," I called out, my voice echoing through the spacious foyer. There was no response. The foyer was grand, with a large chandelier hanging from the ceiling. As I looked around, I noticed signs of a struggle. A vase lay shattered on the marble floor, and there were scuff marks on the walls, as if someone had been forcibly moved or dragged. My heart started pounding. This wasn't right. I placed the bags of food on a small table near the door and debated what to do next. Should I leave and call the police, or should I check if anyone needed help? My curiosity and concern for potential victims got the better of me. I ventured further into the house, stepping carefully to avoid the broken vase pieces. The silence was unnerving. I called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Is anyone here?" Still no answer. The house felt eerily empty, despite the obvious signs that something violent had happened. As I walked through the hallway, I heard a faint noise coming from one of the rooms upstairs. It sounded like a muffled cry or a whimper. My instincts told me to turn back, but I couldn't just leave if someone was in trouble. I found the staircase and ascended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. At the top of the stairs, I saw a trail of drops that looked like blood leading down the hallway. The noise was clearer now, definitely coming from one of the rooms on the right. I followed the trail to a partially closed door. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. Inside, I found a woman tied to a chair, her mouth gagged with a piece of cloth. Her eyes widened in terror when she saw me. I rushed to her side and started untying the ropes around her wrists. "It's okay, I'm here to help," I whispered, hoping to calm her down. Just as I freed her hands, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see a man standing in the doorway, a look of rage on his face. He was tall and muscular, with a menacing presence that made my blood run cold. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. Before I could answer, he lunged at me. I barely managed to dodge his attack, stumbling backward into the woman. We both fell to the floor. I scrambled to my feet and helped her up, our only thought to escape. We bolted out of the room and down the hallway, the man close on our heels. "This way," the woman yelled, leading me towards a back staircase. We descended as quickly as we could, but the man was gaining on us. I could feel his breath on my neck as we reached the ground floor. The kitchen was directly ahead, and I spotted a door that looked like it led to the backyard. We sprinted towards it, flinging it open and running outside. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, but we didn't stop. We kept running, heading towards the edge of the property where a line of trees offered some cover. We ducked into the woods, the branches scratching at our faces and arms as we pushed through the underbrush. The man's shouts grew fainter, but I knew we weren't safe yet. We needed to get to my car and call the police. After what felt like an eternity, we emerged from the woods and found ourselves back on the driveway. My car was still parked at the end, a beacon of hope in the darkness. We sprinted towards it, and I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking. I managed to unlock the doors, and we both jumped in. I started the engine and floored it, speeding away from the house. I didn't stop until we were several miles down the road, pulling into a gas station parking lot. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, explaining everything to the dispatcher as quickly and clearly as I could. The police arrived within minutes. They took our statements and assured us that they would handle the situation. The woman, whose name I learned was Lisa, was still shaken but grateful for my help. She told me that the man was her ex-husband, who had broken into the house with the intent to harm her. As we sat in the back of a police car, waiting for the officers to finish their investigation, I couldn't help but feel a mix of relief and fear. We had escaped, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. The police eventually arrested the man, and Lisa was taken to a safe place. I drove home in a daze, the events of the night replaying in my mind. I had gone from a routine food delivery to a life and death struggle in the span of a few hours. It was a stark reminder of how quickly things can change, and how important it is to trust your instincts. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I kept thinking about Lisa and what might have happened if I hadn't decided to investigate. I realized that sometimes, the right thing to do is also the most dangerous. But in the end, it was worth it to save a life. I was driving home after a late night shift, the road dark and deserted. The clock on my dashboard read 2:15 a.m., and the only sounds were the hum of my engine and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. I was tired, my eyelids heavy from the long hours at work. All I wanted was to get home, take a shower, and collapse into bed. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road. It was a woman, her clothes disheveled, and she was waving her arms frantically. I slowed down, my heart racing. She looked like she was in trouble. I pulled over to the side of the road and rolled down my window. "Are you okay?" I called out. "Please, I need help," she said, her voice trembling. "My car broke down, and I don't have my phone with me. Can you give me a ride to the nearest gas station?" Something about her story seemed off, but I pushed the thought aside. It was late, and she seemed genuinely distressed. "Sure, hop in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. She got in, glancing nervously behind her as if expecting someone to appear out of the darkness. I started driving, the atmosphere inside the car tense. "Where exactly is your car?" I asked, trying to make conversation. She hesitated for a moment before pointing back down the road. "It's about a mile back," she said. "Thank you for stopping. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't." We drove in silence for a few minutes, the road stretching endlessly ahead. Suddenly, she turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "I think someone's following us," she whispered. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness. "I don't see anyone," I said, trying to reassure her. "Please, just keep driving," she insisted. "I don't feel safe." Her fear was palpable, and it began to infect me. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to get to a well-lit area. As we approached a turnoff, She pointed to it. "Take that road," she said. "It leads to a gas station." I took the turn, the road narrowing and becoming rougher. My unease grew with every bump and pothole. The woman kept glancing nervously out the window. "It's just a little further," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We continued down the dark, winding road until we came to a stop at a clearing. Suddenly, out of the darkness, figures emerged. I realized too late that it was an ambush. The woman next to me smiled, a cruel twist to her lips. "Thanks for the ride," she said mockingly. Before I could react, the car doors were yanked open, and rough hands pulled me out. I fought back, but there were too many of them. They pinned me to the ground, their faces obscured by shadows. "What do you want?" I gasped, struggling to break free. One of them leaned down, his breath hot against my ear. "Just your car and anything valuable you have," he sneered. They searched me quickly, taking my wallet, phone, and keys. I was helpless, my mind racing with fear and anger. The woman stood nearby, watching with a detached expression. "You shouldn't have stopped," she said coldly. "You should have kept driving." They left me there, taking my car and everything in it. I lay on the ground, dazed and bruised, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. Slowly, I got to my feet, my body aching. I was in the middle of nowhere, with no phone, no car, and no way to call for help. I started walking, the darkness pressing in around me. The road seemed endless, each step a painful reminder of my situation. I kept moving, driven by a mix of fear and determination. After what felt like hours, I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, desperate to get their attention. The car slowed down, and I approached it cautiously. An elderly couple rolled down the window, their faces filled with concern. "What happened to you?" the woman asked. I quickly explained my situation, and they offered to take me to the nearest police station. As we drove, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability and betrayal. I had tried to help someone in need, only to be taken advantage of in the worst way possible. At the police station, I filed a report, the officers sympathetic but not hopeful about recovering my stolen belongings. The rest of the night was a blur. I got a ride home from the police, my thoughts consumed by the events that had unfolded. I kept replaying the moment I decided to stop, wondering what I could have done differently. It was a sleepless night, my mind too restless to find peace. The next day, I went to work, trying to focus but finding it impossible. The memory of the ambush haunted me, a constant reminder of how quickly things could go wrong. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and more hesitant to trust strangers. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to normal, but I was forever changed. The fear and paranoia lingered, a shadow that followed me everywhere. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a simple robbery. One evening, as I drove home from work, I saw a car broken down on the side of the road. A man stood next to it, waving for help. I hesitated, my heart pounding. I wanted to help, but the memory of that night held me back. I drove past him, guilt gnawing at me, but I couldn't take the risk. The desert stretched endlessly before me, a vast expanse of sand and rocky terrain under the scorching sun. I was on a solo camping trip, something I had dreamed of for years. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape, a chance to connect with nature and find some solitude. Little did I know it would turn into a fight for survival. I set up my tent near a small outcropping of rocks, hoping it would provide some shelter from the relentless heat. The first day went smoothly. I hiked, took photos, and enjoyed the serene beauty of the desert. As night fell, the temperature dropped drastically, and I huddled in my sleeping bag, feeling a sense of calm. The next morning, I awoke early and decided to explore a nearby canyon. The air was cool, and the rising sun painted the landscape in warm hues. I was lost in the beauty of the moment when I heard voices in the distance. I turned to see a group of men approaching, dressed in what appeared to be park ranger uniforms. "Hey there," one of them called out, waving. "Are you camping alone?" I nodded, feeling a mix of relief and caution. "Yes, just enjoying the solitude." "Is everything okay?" "We're just doing a routine check," the leader said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Mind if we take a look around?" Something about their demeanor made me uneasy, but I didn't want to appear suspicious. "Sure, go ahead," I said, trying to sound casual. They split up, inspecting my campsite and my belongings. One of them lingered near my tent, his eyes scanning the area with a disturbing intensity. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This didn't feel right. "So, what brings you out here alone?" the leader asked, his tone almost too friendly. "Just needed some time to myself," I replied, forcing a smile. "I love the desert." "Beautiful place," he agreed. "But it can be dangerous. You should be careful." There was a warning in his words that sent a chill down my spine. They finished their inspection and regrouped. "Everything looks good," the leader said. "But we'll be around if you need anything." They left, their figures shrinking into the distance. I tried to shake off the unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. But as the day wore on, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every rustle of the wind, every distant howl of a coyote made me jump. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my tent. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, holding my breath. "Hey," a voice whispered. "You awake?" I didn't respond, hoping they would go away. The footsteps moved closer, and I could see a shadow through the thin fabric of my tent. I grabbed my flashlight and a small knife, the only weapons I had. Suddenly, the tent zipper started to move. I switched on the flashlight and pointed it at the intruder. It was one of the men from earlier, his face twisted in a malicious grin. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Just checking on you," he said, his tone mocking. "Don't want anything bad to happen to you out here." "Get away from my tent," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. He laughed and backed off, but I could hear him muttering to himself as he walked away. I knew I had to leave. This was no longer a safe place. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my gear as quietly as possible. I needed to put distance between myself and those men. I decided to head toward the nearest ranger station, hoping I could find real help. I walked for hours, the sun climbing higher and the heat becoming unbearable. I rationed my water carefully, knowing I had a long way to go. Every now and then, I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see them following me. In the afternoon, I spotted a small shack in the distance. It looked abandoned, but I was desperate for shade and a place to rest. As I approached, I saw movement inside. My heart sank. It was the men. I ducked behind a boulder, trying to think of what to do. I couldn't turn back now. They would see me for sure. I decided to wait and see if they left. Hours passed, and the sun began to set. The men finally exited the shack, laughing and talking loudly. They got into a truck and drove off, heading in the opposite direction. I waited until I was sure they were gone before I approached the shack. Inside, it was dark and musty, but it provided some shelter. I found a few old supplies, canned food and a rusty knife. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about those men and what they wanted. Why were they pretending to be rangers? What were they planning? I knew I had to keep moving. At first light, I set off again, heading in the direction of the ranger station. I walked all day, the terrain becoming more difficult and my water supply dwindling. I started to feel lightheaded, but I pushed on, driven by fear and determination. Just as I thought I couldn't go any further, I heard the sound of an engine. I ducked behind a rock, my heart racing. It was a real ranger vehicle, and relief washed over me. I stood up and waved frantically. The ranger saw me and pulled over. "Are you okay?" he asked, concern in his voice. "No," I said, tears of relief streaming down my face. "There are men out here pretending to be rangers. They're dangerous. Please, help me." He got out of the vehicle and helped me inside. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this area," he said. "You're lucky you found me." As we drove to the ranger station, I couldn't stop shaking. The ordeal had left me exhausted and terrified. But I was safe now. The real rangers took my report and assured me they would investigate. I'd been working the night shift at St. Andrew's Hospital for nearly a year now. It was quiet most nights, the halls echoing with the occasional soft beep of machines and distant chatter of nurses. My job as a janitor was to keep the place tidy, emptying trash bins, mopping floors, and making sure everything was in order for the day's shift. One night, around 3 a.m., I was making my rounds on the third floor when I noticed something odd. Samantha, one of the nurses on duty, was acting strangely near the supply closet. She kept glancing around nervously, checking over her shoulder as she fumbled with the door lock. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached quietly, trying to see what she was up to. To my shock, Samantha was carefully removing vials of medication from the closet and stashing them in her bag. My mind raced with disbelief and concern. This couldn't be right. Nurses were supposed to administer medication, not take it. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I needed to think carefully about what to do next. Samantha was a big woman, tough and known to be a bit volatile. Confronting her directly seemed risky, but I couldn't just ignore what I had seen. Patients' lives could be at stake. I decided to keep an eye on her, observing from a distance while I continued my duties. Samantha moved from room to room, administering medications as if nothing was amiss. But every now and then, she would slip something into her pocket or purse when she thought no one was looking. As the night wore on, my anxiety grew. I couldn't let this go on. But how could I expose her without putting myself in danger? I knew I had to gather evidence, something concrete to prove what she was doing. I made a mental note to keep a close watch on her movements and document anything suspicious. Around 4 a.m., Samantha disappeared into the supply closet again. This time, I followed at a safe distance, making sure to stay out of sight. She emerged a few minutes later, carrying a small bag filled with vials of medication. My suspicions were confirmed. I needed to confront her, but I had to be smart about it. I waited until she was alone in the break room, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Taking a deep breath, I approached cautiously. "Samantha," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "I saw what you were doing in the supply closet." She froze, her eyes narrowing. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her tone defensive. "I saw you taking medication," I replied, keeping my distance. "You're smuggling drugs out of here." Her face turned red with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about," she hissed. "Mind your own business." I could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. Samantha was unpredictable, and I knew I had to tread carefully. "I'm not going to let this go," I said firmly. "I have to report it." Before I could react, Samantha lunged forward, grabbing me by the collar of my uniform. "You're not going to say anything," she growled, her grip tightening. "If you do, I'll make sure you regret it." Fear gripped me like a vice. Samantha was much stronger than I had anticipated. I struggled against her grip, trying to break free. "Let me go," I gasped, my heart racing. She hesitated for a moment, studying me with narrowed eyes. Then, without warning, she shoved me backward, sending me crashing into a nearby table. Pain shot through my back as I hit the ground, the wind knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Samantha was advancing toward me, fury etched on her face. I knew I had to get out of there, find help before things escalated further. I bolted from the break room, ignoring the pain in my side. My mind raced as I searched for a way to expose Samantha's illegal activities without endangering myself. The hospital was eerily quiet, the night shift staff occupied with their duties. I needed someone I could trust, someone who could help me without putting themselves at risk. As I rounded a corner, I nearly collided with Dr. Patel, one of the senior physicians on duty. He raised an eyebrow at my disheveled appearance. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I hesitated for a moment, unsure if I could trust him. But time was running out. "I need to talk to you," I said urgently, glancing over my shoulder. Dr. Patel led me to a quiet corner of the hallway, away from prying eyes. "What's going on?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. "It's Samantha," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "She's smuggling drugs out of the hospital." Dr. Patel's eyes widened in surprise. "Are you sure?" he asked, his tone serious. "I saw her with my own eyes," I replied, desperation creeping into my voice. "She threatened me when I confronted her. I don't know what to do." He nodded thoughtfully, weighing his options. "We need to report this," he said finally. "But we have to be careful. Samantha is dangerous." I nodded in agreement, feeling a sense of relief that someone believed me. Dr. Patel led me to the hospital administrator's office, explaining the situation in hushed tones. The administrator listened intently, her expression grave. "We'll launch an investigation immediately," she said, her voice firm. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." As the hours passed, the hospital buzzed with activity. I stayed close to Dr. Patel, afraid to be alone after what had happened with Samantha. Nurses and staff whispered among themselves, casting wary glances in my direction. By morning, Samantha was escorted from the hospital by security. She fought and screamed, her rage echoing down the hallway. I watched from a safe distance, feeling a mixture of fear and relief. The danger was over, but the memory of her threats lingered in my mind. In the days that followed, the hospital tightened security measures, implementing stricter protocols for handling medications. I was commended for my bravery, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Samantha had made it clear that she would stop at nothing to protect her secret. I continued to work the night shift, my senses on high alert. Every sound made me jump, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. But as time passed, the fear slowly faded, replaced by a sense of pride. I had stood up to a dangerous criminal and helped expose her illegal activities. But the experience had changed me. I no longer saw the hospital as a place of healing and safety. I decided to take a solo camping trip in the dense forests of Oregon, looking to escape the daily grind and find some peace. I packed my gear and drove to a remote spot deep in the woods. The first day was perfect, just me, the sounds of nature, and the fresh air. I set up my tent near a small creek and spent the day hiking and exploring. By evening, I was exhausted but content. I started a small fire, cooked some dinner, and settled in for the night. The forest around me was dark and quiet, the only sounds being the rustling of leaves and distant animal calls. It felt peaceful, and I drifted off to sleep easily. The next morning, I decided to explore further. I packed a small bag with some essentials and headed deeper into the woods. The trees were thick, and the underbrush made it hard to see too far ahead. After a few hours of hiking, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. Through the trees, I saw a clearing with several men gathered around. They were armed, and it looked like they were up to something illegal. There were crates and bags scattered around, and they were talking in low, urgent voices. I realized with a shock that I had stumbled upon some kind of illegal operation. I knew I had to get out of there quietly. I turned and started to make my way back the way I came, but I must have made some noise because I heard one of them shout, "Hey! Who's there?" Panic surged through me, and I took off running. The forest was a maze of trees and underbrush. I could hear them behind me, crashing through the woods, shouting and cursing. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. I needed to find a place to hide and figure out what to do next. I came across a dense thicket and dove into it, trying to stay as still and quiet as possible. I could hear them nearby, their voices getting closer. One of them said, "He can't be far. Spread out and find him." I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, their voices started to fade. I waited a little longer before cautiously moving again. I needed to get back to my campsite, grab my gear, and get out of there. But the forest was disorienting, and I wasn't sure which way to go. I moved slowly, trying to stay hidden and avoid making noise. Every twig snap and rustle of leaves made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them coming after me. My mind raced with thoughts of what they might do if they caught me. Hours passed, and I felt like I was getting nowhere. The forest was endless, and every direction looked the same. My mouth was dry, and my legs felt like lead. I knew I needed to find water and figure out a plan. As night started to fall, I found a small stream and stopped to drink and catch my breath. The water was cold and refreshing, but I knew I couldn't stay there long. I had to keep moving, keep putting distance between me and those men. I decided to follow the stream, hoping it would lead me to safety. The sound of the water masked my footsteps, and I felt a small sense of relief. But I knew I wasn't out of danger yet. I kept moving, driven by fear and the need to survive. The forest grew darker, and I struggled to see where I was going. I tripped over roots and stumbled through the underbrush, my senses on high alert. Every shadow looked like a threat, every sound made me jump. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I saw a faint light through the trees. I moved towards it, hoping it was a sign of civilization. As I got closer, I realized it was a cabin, with a small light shining from inside. I approached cautiously, not sure who or what I might find. I knocked on the door, and an older man answered, looking surprised and concerned. I quickly explained my situation, and he ushered me inside, locking the door behind me. The man, who introduced himself as Joe, was a retired forest ranger. He listened to my story and immediately called the authorities. He assured me that help was on the way and that I was safe for the moment. We waited in tense silence, listening for any sounds outside. I kept expecting those men to show up, but the night remained quiet. Finally, We heard the sound of sirens in the distance, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The police arrived and took my statement, promising to investigate and find the men responsible. They escorted me back to my campsite to gather my things, then drove me to safety. I was exhausted and shaken, but grateful to be alive. In the days that followed, I tried to put the experience behind me. The police continued their investigation, and I hoped they would bring those men to justice. It was a harrowing experience, one that reminded me of the dangers that can lurk even in the most peaceful of places. I haven't been camping alone since that day. I had been working the night shift at the 24-hour laundromat for about 6 months. It was a quiet job in a quiet town, and I usually enjoyed the solitude. Most nights were uneventful, just me folding laundry and listening to the hum of the machines. One night, around midnight, I noticed a man standing outside the window. At first, I didn't think much of it. People sometimes wandered by, maybe waiting for someone or taking a break from a walk. But this man was different. He was just standing there, staring directly at me. I tried to ignore him, focusing on folding the clothes in front of me. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, eyes fixed on me. It started to make me uncomfortable, but I told myself he would eventually move on. An hour passed, and he was still there. The laundromat was empty, as usual for that time of night, and I started to feel more uneasy. His stare was intense, and he hadn't moved an inch. I debated calling someone, but I didn't want to overreact. Around 2 a.m., he suddenly disappeared from the window. I felt a brief sense of relief, thinking he had finally left. But that relief was short-lived. I heard a noise at the back door, like someone jiggling the handle. My heart began to race. I walked to the back, trying to be quiet. I peeked through the small window in the door and saw him there, trying to force it open. Panic set in. I quickly locked the door and grabbed my phone, dialing 911. The dispatcher answered, and I tried to explain the situation as calmly as possible. They assured me that a patrol car was on its way, but it would take at least 15 minutes. I didn't have 15 minutes. The man was now banging on the door, getting more aggressive. I looked around for something to defend myself with and grabbed a heavy metal rod we used to unclog the machines. My hands were shaking, but I felt a little better having something to protect myself with. The banging stopped, and for a moment there was silence. I hoped he had given up, but then I heard the front door rattle. I had forgotten to lock it. I ran to the front, but it was too late. He had managed to get inside. He stood there, looking at me with cold eyes. He didn't say anything, just started walking towards me. I backed away, holding the rod in front of me, trying to keep a safe distance. "Stay back," I shouted, my voice trembling. "I've called the police. They're on their way." He didn't respond, just kept coming closer. I swung the rod, trying to keep him at bay, but he dodged it easily. He was fast, and I was terrified. I kept backing up until I hit the wall, nowhere else to go. He lunged at me, and I swung the rod again, this time connecting with his arm. He grunted in pain but didn't stop. He grabbed the rod and ripped it from my hands, throwing it across the room. I was defenseless. I tried to run, but he caught me, pushing me to the ground. I struggled, kicking and screaming, trying to break free. He was strong, and I felt myself getting weaker, fear overwhelming me. Just as I thought it was over, I heard sirens in the distance. The man heard them too and hesitated. He looked at me, anger in his eyes, but he knew he had to leave. He got up and ran out the back door, disappearing into the night. I lay there, shaken and bruised, as the police arrived. They found me on the floor, barely able to speak. They helped me up and took my statement, assuring me they would do everything they could to find the man. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, replaying it in my mind. The police kept in touch, but there was no sign of him. I took some time off work, trying to recover from the ordeal. Eventually, I went back to the laundromat. It was hard, being in the place where it all happened, but I refused to let fear control me. I made sure to keep the doors locked and stay vigilant, always aware of my surroundings. The man was never caught, but I tried to move on with my life. The memory of that night still haunted me, but I took comfort in knowing I had survived. It was a reminder of how quickly things could change, how danger could appear out of nowhere. I learned to be more cautious, to trust my instincts, and to never take safety for granted. Driving home during a severe thunderstorm in rural Texas was not my idea of a good time. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see the road ahead. Lightning lit up the sky every few seconds, and the wind howled through the trees lining the highway. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I tried to focus on staying in my lane. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a figure standing by the side of the road. A man, drenched from head to toe, waving his arms frantically. My first instinct was to keep driving, but something made me slow down and pull over. Maybe it was the storm, or maybe it was just a sense of decency. Either way, I stopped and rolled down the window a crack. "Hey, you need a ride?" I shouted over the roar of the storm. "Yeah, please." "My car broke down, and I can't get it started," he yelled back. He looked desperate and cold, and I felt a pang of sympathy. "Hop in," I said, unlocking the door. He climbed in, dripping water all over the passenger seat. I could see he was shivering, and I turned up the heat to try and warm him up. "Thanks, man. I really appreciate it," he said, his teeth chattering. "No problem. Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Just up the road a bit." "Anywhere dry is fine," he replied. He didn't offer much more information, and I didn't press him. We drove in silence for a few minutes, the sound of the rain pounding on the roof filling the car. I glanced over at him a few times, noticing he kept fidgeting with something in his pocket. His eyes darted around nervously, and he kept looking back at the road behind us. Something about his behavior set me on edge, but I tried to brush it off. He was probably just shaken up from the storm. Suddenly, he pulled out a knife and pointed it at me. "Keep driving. Don't try anything stupid," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. My heart jumped into my throat. Okay, just stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice from shaking. I kept my eyes on the road, my mind racing. How did I end up in this situation? I needed to find a way out, but I had to play it cool. "Turn off here," he instructed, pointing to a narrow dirt road that branched off the highway. I did as he said, my mind working overtime to figure out a plan. The dirt road was bumpy and barely visible in the rain, but I navigated it as best I could. After a few minutes, he told me to pull over. "Give me your phone," he demanded. I handed it over without argument. He took it and smashed it against the dashboard, breaking it into pieces. "Can't have you calling anyone," he said with a smirk. "Look, you don't have to do this," I said, trying to reason with him. "Just take the car and go." "I won't tell anyone." He laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think I'm that stupid?" "No, you're coming with me." "Get out of the car." I got out slowly, the rain soaking me instantly. He came around to my side, the knife still in his hand. "Move," he said, gesturing towards the trees. I started walking, my mind racing. I needed to find a way to escape. We walked through the trees, the storm making it hard to see or hear anything. The mud sucked at my shoes, making each step a struggle. He stayed close behind me, the knife never far from my back. Suddenly, a loud crack of thunder startled us both, and I saw my chance. I turned and shoved him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, losing his footing in the mud, and I took off running. The rain was blinding, but I didn't care. I had to get away. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran through the trees, branches whipping in my face, the mud slowing me down. My heart was pounding in my chest, fear driving me forward. I stumbled into a clearing and saw a small cabin in the distance. I ran towards it, hoping someone was home. I reached the door and pounded on it, shouting for help. The door opened, and an elderly man stood there, looking confused. "Please, help me." "There's a man with a knife," I gasped, my breath coming in ragged bursts. He pulled me inside and locked the door. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, looking out the window. I quickly explained the situation, my words tumbling over each other in my panic. He nodded and went to get his phone. "I'll call the police," he said. I stood by the window, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of my attacker. The minutes felt like hours as we waited for the police to arrive. Finally, I saw the flashing lights of a patrol car, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. The police took my statement and searched the area for the man, but he was nowhere to be found. They promised to keep looking and gave me a ride home. I thanked the elderly man for his help and got into the patrol car, feeling exhausted and shaken. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The man's face, his knife, the rain, the fear. It all played over and over in my mind. I knew I would never forget that night, and I would always be more cautious about picking up strangers. I spent the next few days on edge, jumping at every noise, looking over my shoulder constantly. The police kept me updated, but there was no sign of the man. I tried to get back to my normal routine, but it was hard. I was staying at this budget hotel in a small town for a work trip. It was nothing fancy, just a place to sleep for a few nights. The first night was uneventful, just the usual restless sleep in an unfamiliar bed. I locked the door and wedged a chair under the handle, a habit from my frequent travels. The second night, I woke up feeling strange, like something was off. The room felt colder, and there was a faint smell I couldn't place. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the old air conditioning system acting up. I checked the door, and it was still locked, the chair still in place. So, I went back to bed, but it took a while to fall asleep again. The next morning, I noticed my things weren't quite where I left them. My suitcase was slightly open, and my clothes looked rummaged through. I thought maybe I was just being paranoid, that I was remembering things wrong. But the feeling of unease stayed with me the whole day. That night, I decided to stay up a bit later, just to see if I could catch anything. Around 2 a.m., I heard a faint click. My heart started pounding as I realized it was the sound of the door unlocking. I stayed as still as I could, pretending to be asleep. The door opened slowly, and I could see the silhouette of someone standing there. It was the hotel manager. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching me. I kept my breathing steady, terrified he'd notice I was awake. After a few minutes, he closed the door and left. I didn't sleep at all after that. I just lay there, thinking about what to do. In the morning, I went down to the front desk to confront him. He acted like nothing was wrong, smiling and asking if I slept well. My skin crawled at the sight of his fake smile. I wanted to scream at him, but I was scared of what he might do if I accused him outright. I decided to play it cool and check out early, finding another hotel in the next town over. As I was packing, I found a small camera hidden in the air vent, pointing directly at the bed. My stomach turned, realizing he'd been watching me the whole time. I grabbed my things and left as quickly as I could, not caring if he saw me leave. I went to the police station in the next town and told them everything. They took me seriously, which was a relief. They sent an officer to the hotel to check it out. I waited, feeling anxious and exposed, like he was still watching me somehow. The police found more cameras in other rooms, and they arrested the manager. It turned out he had been doing this for months, if not years. The thought of how many other people he had watched made me sick. They thanked me for coming forward, saying it was a crucial piece of evidence that would help convict him. Even though he was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stayed in a hotel after that, I checked the vents, the smoke detectors, any place a camera could be hidden. I slept with one eye open, always on edge. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I didn't trust people as easily as I used to. It was a hard lesson, but I was glad I got out safely. I was working a late-night shift delivering food in a pretty rough neighborhood. It wasn't my favorite area to go to, but the tips were usually decent. I got an order around 11 p.m., and the address was in one of those dimly lit streets where the streetlights barely worked. Still, I had a job to do. I pulled up to the address and parked. The house looked run down, with the front yard overgrown and the porch light flickering. I grabbed the food and made my way to the door, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. As I knocked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched. No one answered the door. I knocked again, harder this time, and called out that their food was here. Still nothing. I was about to turn back to my car when I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. 3 guys were coming around the side of the house. They looked rough, like they had a hard life and weren't afraid to make someone else's hard too. One of them, a tall guy with a shaved head and a scar across his cheek, spoke first. "What you got there, man?" he asked, eyeing the food in the delivery bag slung over my shoulder. "Just a delivery," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I was just leaving." "Nah, you ain't leaving yet," another guy said, stepping closer. He was shorter but built like a tank, with tattoos sneaking up his arms. "We want what's in the bag." I backed up, my heart racing. "It's just food," I said, holding it out. "Take it." Scarface shook his head. "We want the money too." "Hand it over." I glanced at my car, calculating the distance. "I don't have much cash on me," I lied, hoping they'd believe me. I felt the weight of the night's earnings in my pocket, though. If they found out, I was screwed. The third guy, who'd been silent until now, pulled out a knife. "Don't make this harder than it has to be. Give us the money, and you can walk away." Fear shot through me. I threw the food at them and bolted for my car. I heard them curse and start after me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I reached my car and yanked the door open, jumping inside. As I fumbled for the keys, I saw them closing in. I started the car just as the guy with the knife reached my window. He slammed the knife against the glass, but thankfully, it didn't break. I floored the gas pedal and tore out of there, tires screeching. In the rearview mirror, I saw them running after me for a few yards before giving up. I didn't slow down until I was several blocks away, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I pulled into a gas station parking lot, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I checked the rearview mirror constantly, terrified they might have followed me. After a few minutes, I called my boss and told him what happened. He told me to come back to the restaurant and take the rest of the night off. I agreed, still shaking. As I drove back, I kept thinking about how close I'd come to getting hurt or worse. When I got back to the restaurant, my boss was waiting. He took one look at me and shook his head. "Take the night off," he said. "And don't go back to that neighborhood." I didn't need to be told twice. I went home, locked all my doors, and tried to calm down. It was hours before I could sleep, and even then, I kept waking up, hearing their voices in my head. The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. But the truth was, I did the only thing I could. I ran. And I was lucky to get away. I went back to work a few days later, but I made sure to avoid that neighborhood. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, and every time I saw a group of guys hanging out on a corner, my heart would start racing. It was a rough reminder that no job is worth risking your life for. I was driving home late one night, passing through a remote stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever. The sky was pitch black, no moon, and the road was empty. I was used to this drive, but it always made me a bit uneasy. I turned up the radio to keep myself company, the only sound besides the hum of my engine. About an hour into my drive, I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another car on the road. But after a while, I realized the car was still behind me, maintaining the same distance. I told myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe they were headed the same way. After another 10 minutes, I started to get this weird feeling. The car wasn't passing me, and there weren't any other cars around. I decided to test it. I sped up a bit. The car sped up too. I slowed down, and they slowed down. My heart began to race. This wasn't normal. I tried to shake them off. I took an unexpected turn down a side road. The car followed. I turned again, trying to lose them in a maze of back roads. But no matter what I did, they stuck to me like glue. I could see the outline of the car now, dark and menacing, its headlights glaring like eyes. Panic started to set in. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. I grabbed my phone and tried to call for help, but there was no signal. I cursed under my breath. I was truly alone out here, no way to call for help. I kept driving, my mind racing. I had to think of something. I remembered a small rest stop a few miles ahead. It wasn't much, just a bathroom and some vending machines, but it was lit and had cameras. Maybe if I got there, they'd back off. I sped towards the rest stop, praying they wouldn't do anything crazy before I got there. As I approached, I could see the lights in the distance. Relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. The car behind me suddenly sped up, swerving aggressively. They were trying to run me off the road. I gripped the wheel, trying to keep control. The car rammed into my bumper, and I nearly lost it. My car swerved, but I managed to stay on the road. I could see the rest stop now, just a little further. I pushed my car to its limit, the engine roaring as I raced towards the lights. I pulled into the rest stop, my tires screeching. The car followed, but they stopped at the entrance, just watching. I jumped out of my car and ran towards the building, hoping anyone, would be there. But it was empty. Just me and the cameras. I glanced back. The car was still there, idling. I didn't know what to do. I was terrified they'd come after me, but they just stayed in their car, headlights blinding me. I decided to stay in the lit area, hoping the cameras would deter them. Minutes felt like hours. I kept looking around, expecting them to make a move. But they didn't. Eventually, another car pulled into the rest stop. A family, by the looks of it. The car at the entrance revved its engine and sped off into the night. I collapsed against the wall, shaking with relief. The family looked at me, concerned. I told them what happened, and they offered to drive with me until I got to a safer area. I gratefully accepted. I followed them back onto the highway, glancing in my rearview mirror the whole time. But the car didn't come back. When I finally got home, I couldn't stop shaking. I locked all my doors and windows, double-checking everything. It was hours before I could sleep, and even then, I kept waking up, hearing the roar of that engine in my dreams. The next day, I reported the incident to the police, but there wasn't much they could do. No plates, no real description. Just a vague warning to be careful. It didn't make me feel any better. I still drive that road sometimes, but I'm always on edge, constantly checking my mirrors. I'll never forget that night, and I'll always wonder who was in that car and what they wanted. We had been planning this camping trip for months. It was supposed to be a fun getaway from the stress of work and city life. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Sarah, her boyfriend Mike, and my boyfriend Tom. We chose a secluded area in the woods, far from any trails or other campers. It was beautiful, peaceful, and exactly what we needed. The first night was perfect. We set up our tents, built a campfire, and spent hours talking and laughing under the stars. It was one of those nights where everything feels right. I remember thinking how lucky I was to have such good friends and to be in such a beautiful place. We all went to bed late, tired but happy. I fell asleep almost instantly, the sounds of the forest lulling me into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up suddenly. Something felt off. I sat up and looked around. It was still dark, but I could see the outline of the tents. Tom was beside me, sleeping soundly. I unzipped the tent quietly and stepped outside. The fire had died down to embers, and the night was eerily silent. I walked over to Sarah and Mike's tent and whispered their names. No response. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I called their names a little louder. Still nothing. I unzipped their tent and peered inside. Mike was there, but Sarah's sleeping bag was empty. I shook Mike awake, my heart pounding. He looked confused and groggy as I told him Sarah was missing. He got up quickly, and we started searching the campsite, calling her name. Tom woke up and joined us, his face pale with worry. We searched the immediate area, but there was no sign of her. As the sun began to rise, we decided to venture further into the woods. We split up, each taking a different direction, and agreed to meet back at the campsite in an hour. I walked through the trees, calling Sarah's name, my voice echoing in the stillness. The forest seemed to close in around me, every rustle and snap of a twig making my heart race. After about an hour, I headed back to the campsite, hoping the others had found her. When I got there, Tom and Mike were waiting, but there was no sign of Sarah. Mike looked frantic. He said he found something strange, a small clearing with what looked like a makeshift shelter. It was old and abandoned, but it gave us a clue that someone else might be out here. We decided to check it out together. Mike led us through the woods to the clearing. As we approached, I felt a chill run down my spine. The shelter was nothing more than a few branches and leaves arranged to form a crude hut. Inside, we found old cans, empty bottles, and some tattered clothes. It was clear someone had been living here, but there was no sign of Sarah. As we stood there, we heard a noise. It was faint but unmistakable, the sound of someone moving through the woods. We turned towards the sound, and that's when we saw him. A man, maybe in his 50s, with a wild look in his eyes, was watching us from the trees. He didn't say anything, just stared at us with an intense, almost animalistic gaze. Mike called out to him, asking if he had seen Sarah. The man didn't respond. Instead, he took a step back, disappearing into the shadows. We chased after him, our fear giving way to desperation. But the man was fast, and he knew the woods better than we did. We lost him quickly, and with him, any hope of finding Sarah. We returned to the campsite, feeling helpless and scared. We had no choice but to keep searching. As the day wore on, our anxiety grew. We were miles from help, and it was becoming clear that we weren't alone out here. We decided to stick together and search as a group, hoping we would find Sarah before nightfall. As dusk approached, we heard her scream. It was faint but unmistakable. We ran towards the sound, our hearts pounding. The scream led us to a small ravine, hidden deep in the woods. There, at the bottom, we saw Sarah. She was alive but looked terrified and hurt. We scrambled down to her, and she told us what happened. She had woken up in the middle of the night to find the man standing over her. He had dragged her out of the tent and taken her to the ravine, but she managed to escape when he got distracted. We helped her back to the campsite, all of us on high alert. We knew the man was still out there, watching us. We decided we couldn't stay another night. We packed up our gear as quickly as we could, constantly looking over our shoulders. As we made our way back to the car, the forest seemed to come alive with sounds. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. We stuck close together, moving as quickly as we could. The feeling of being watched never left us. Finally, we reached the car and piled in, locking the doors behind us. As we drove away, I looked back and saw the man standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. His expression was one of pure anger and hatred. We reported the incident to the authorities, but there wasn't much they could do. The man was never found, and we never went back to that part of the woods again. The memory of that night still haunts me, the feeling of being hunted, of knowing that someone was out there, watching us, waiting for their chance. I've never felt safe in the woods since. I took the night guard job at the old factory because it was supposed to be easy money. The place had been shut down for years, but the owners wanted someone to keep an eye on it. They said it was mostly to prevent kids from sneaking in or squatters from setting up camp. The first few nights were quiet, almost too quiet. The silence was unsettling, but I got used to it. The factory was huge, filled with empty rooms and long corridors. The dim lights cast strange shadows, making everything look eerie. I made my rounds, carrying a flashlight and my phone. There was a landline in the small security office, but it felt like it hadn't been used in ages. One night, around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was faint, but it sounded like a door closing. I stopped and listened. The noise came from the other side of the factory. I felt a chill run down my spine. I told myself it was probably just the wind or an animal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to check it out. I walked slowly, trying to be as quiet as possible. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the empty halls. I reached the area where I thought the noise came from. It was one of the large storage rooms. I shone my flashlight around but didn't see anything unusual. Then I heard it again, a faint shuffling sound. It was coming from behind a stack of old crates. My heart was pounding in my chest. I moved closer, my hand trembling as I held the flashlight. I peered around the crates and saw them, 3 men, hunched over a table covered with tools and equipment. They looked like they were in the middle of some kind of operation. My first thought was that they were thieves, using the factory as a hideout. My second thought was that I needed to get out of there without them seeing me. I backed away slowly, trying not to make any noise. But as I turned, my flashlight slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a loud clatter. The men looked up, their eyes locking onto me. I froze for a second, then turned and ran. I could hear them shouting and chasing after me. I dashed down the corridors, my heart racing. I needed to get to the security office and call for help. But the factory was like a maze, and I kept taking wrong turns. I could hear their footsteps getting closer. I ducked into a small room and closed the door quietly. I pressed my ear against it, listening. They were right outside, their voices angry and loud. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like an eternity, their voices faded. I waited a few more minutes before opening the door and peeking out. The coast was clear. I crept down the hall, moving as quickly and quietly as I could. I reached the security office and locked the door behind me. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking. The operator answered, and I quickly explained the situation. They said officers were on their way. I hung up and sat down, trying to calm myself. But then I heard a banging on the door. They had found me. I looked around for something to defend myself with. There was a heavy flashlight on the desk, and I grabbed it. The door was shaking as they tried to break it down. I backed up against the wall, holding the flashlight like a weapon. The door burst open, and the men rushed in. I swung the flashlight, hitting the first one in the head. He stumbled back, but the other 2 were on me in an instant. They grabbed me, pinning me to the ground. I struggled, but they were too strong. Then I heard the sirens. The men hesitated, their grip loosening for just a moment. I took the chance and broke free, running towards the open door. The police were already inside the factory, and the men turned to flee. The officers caught them quickly, and I collapsed to the floor, exhausted and relieved. The police took my statement and assured me that the men would be dealt with. They were part of a gang that had been using the factory as a base for their operations. I never went back to that job. The owners hired a security company to handle it after that night. The experience left me shaken. I had never been so scared in my life. It was pouring rain that night, and I could barely see the road. I was driving back from my sister's place, which was a good 3-hour drive. The storm had come out of nowhere, and my old car wasn't handling it well. Suddenly, the engine sputtered, and the car came to a stop. I tried turning the key again, but it was dead. My heart sank. I was alone on a deserted highway with no cell service. I sat there for a moment, the rain pounding on the roof, thinking about what to do. I decided to get out and check under the hood, even though I didn't know much about cars. As soon as I stepped out, I was drenched. The rain was freezing, and the wind was making it hard to stand. I opened the hood and stared at the engine, not really sure what I was looking for. After a few minutes, headlights appeared in the distance. I felt a bit of relief. Maybe someone could help me. A large truck slowed down and pulled over in front of my car. The The driver, a burly man in his 50s, climbed out and walked over to me. He asked if I needed help, and I explained my car had broken down. He looked at the engine and told me it didn't look good. He offered to give me a ride to the nearest town, which was about 20 miles away. I hesitated but realized I didn't have much choice. I grabbed my purse and locked the car, then climbed into the passenger seat of his truck. We drove in silence for a few minutes. I tried to make small talk, asking his name and where he was headed. He told me his name was Tom and he was heading home after a long haul. Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I told myself I was just being paranoid. After a while, he started asking me questions, where I was from, if I was traveling alone. I answered vaguely, feeling more and more uncomfortable. His tone had changed, and there was a strange look in his eyes. I glanced at the door, thinking about jumping out, but we were going too fast. Suddenly, he turned off the highway onto a dark, narrow road. I asked where we were going, and he said it was a shortcut. My gut told me something was very wrong. I told him I wanted to go back to the main road, but he ignored me. Panic started to set in. I reached for my phone, even though I knew there was no signal. He noticed and grabbed my wrist, squeezing it hard. He told me to put the phone away and keep quiet. My mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. I glanced around the cab, looking for anything I could use as a weapon. There was a heavy flashlight on the floor near my feet. We drove for what felt like an eternity. Finally, he stopped the truck in a secluded area surrounded by trees. He turned off the engine and looked at me with a creepy smile. He told me to get out. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I knew I had to act fast. As he reached across to open my door, I grabbed the flashlight and swung it at his head with all my strength. He yelped in pain and loosened his grip. I shoved the door open and ran into the stormy night, not looking back. I could hear him cursing and stumbling out of the truck. The rain was blinding, and the mud made it hard to run, but I kept going. I heard him shouting, getting closer. I spotted a small building in the distance and ran toward it. It looked like an old, abandoned cabin. I prayed the door was unlocked. I reached it and twisted the knob. It opened, and I slipped inside, shutting the door quietly behind me. I looked around in the dark, trying to find something to barricade the door. There was an old table, and I pushed it against the door as quietly as I could. I hid in a corner, clutching the flashlight, my heart racing. I could hear his footsteps outside, crunching on the gravel. He banged on the door, shouting for me to come out. I stayed silent, hoping he would think I had kept running. After a while, the noise stopped. I waited, listening to the rain and my own ragged breathing. I didn't dare move. Hours passed, and finally, the storm began to let up. I still didn't move, too scared to believe he was gone. As dawn approached, I heard another vehicle coming down the road. I peeked out a crack in the wall and saw a police car. Relief washed over me. I banged on the window, shouting for help. The officer got out and approached the cabin cautiously. I opened the door and ran out, explaining everything in a rush. The officer took me to the station, where I gave my statement. They sent a tow truck to get my car and promised to search for Tom. They said I was lucky to be alive. I still have nightmares about that night. I had been on this business trip for a few days now, halfway across the world in a foreign country. The city was bustling, vibrant during the day but quieter at night. It was my first time here, and while the work was demanding, I was eager to explore the culture and sights. One evening, after finishing up a late meeting, I noticed a man lingering outside the building. He stood out a bit too well dressed for the neighborhood, his eyes darting around as if searching for something or someone. I didn't think much of it at first, attributing it to my tiredness and the unfamiliarity of the place. I decided to take a longer route back to my hotel, just to see more of the city. I kept glancing over my shoulder, and each time, I saw the same man, a distance away, but always there. The hairs on my neck prickled, and I quickened my pace, my heart beginning to race with a growing unease. By the time I reached my hotel, I was sure he had followed me. I entered cautiously, looking around for any sign of him, but the lobby was empty except for the receptionist. I tried to shake off the feeling, chiding myself for being paranoid. Maybe it was just a coincidence. But when I got to my room on the 8th floor, the feeling of dread intensified. The door was slightly ajar, and I knew I had locked it before leaving. My heart pounded as I cautiously pushed it open. The room had been ransacked, drawers pulled out, clothes strewn across the floor, papers scattered everywhere. I rushed inside, checking if anything valuable was missing. My laptop and phone were still there, but the room felt violated, invaded. I closed the door quietly, trying not to panic. Someone had definitely been here, searching for something. Was it the man who had followed me? Why was he after me? I immediately called the hotel reception, my voice trembling slightly as I reported the break-in. They assured me they would send security up right away. While I waited, I searched through my belongings, trying to piece together what could have been taken or tampered with. Nothing seemed missing, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Security arrived quickly, a team of 2 guards who inspected the room thoroughly, asking me questions about when I had last been in the room and if I had seen anyone suspicious around. I described the man I had noticed following me earlier, and they exchanged concerned glances. They assured me they would increase patrols and keep an eye out for anyone matching his description. They advised me not to leave the hotel alone and to contact them immediately if I saw him again. I thanked them, feeling a bit safer with their presence, but the fear of being targeted gnawed at me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the hotel floorboards, every distant sound in the hallway made me jump. I kept the lights on, feeling exposed and vulnerable. The next morning, I hesitated to leave my room but forced myself to attend my scheduled meetings. I couldn't let this incident derail my work. Throughout the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept scanning the faces in the crowds, half expecting to see the man from the night before. My mind raced with questions. Why was he after me? What did he want? Was it something to do with my work or just a random act? That evening, after returning to the hotel, I noticed an envelope slipped under my door. My heart skipped a beat as I picked it up. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message scrawled in messy handwriting. Stay away. This is your only warning. My hands trembled as I read the words over and over, trying to make sense of them. Who was threatening me? What did they want me to stay away from? I called the front desk immediately, explaining what had happened and showing them the note. They assured me they would take it seriously and increase security measures. Fear gripped me tighter now. I couldn't stay in my room, feeling like a sitting duck. I decided to go down to the lobby and wait there, where there were more people around. I kept glancing nervously at the entrance, half expecting to see the man or someone else who looked suspicious. Hours passed, and nothing happened. The hotel staff checked in on me regularly, offering reassurances and asking if I needed anything. I appreciated their concern but couldn't shake the fear that had settled in my chest. As night fell again, I debated whether to change hotels or even leave the city altogether. But I had commitments here, and running away felt like giving in to the fear. I resolved to stay vigilant, to watch my surroundings closely, and to trust that the hotel security would keep me safe. That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and barely slept, jumping at every sound. Morning came slowly, and with it, a sense of relief that I had made it through another night unharmed. I packed my bags quickly, eager to leave the hotel behind. Before checking out, I spoke to the hotel manager, expressing my concerns and asking for any updates. He assured me they were cooperating with the local authorities and would continue to monitor the situation. He offered his apologies for the ordeal I had been through, and I appreciated his understanding. I left the hotel with mixed emotions, relief to be leaving but lingering fear about what had happened and whether the threat was truly over. I kept looking over my shoulder as I made my way to the airport, half expecting to see the man again. The flight back home felt like a sanctuary, a return to safety. I couldn't wait to be back in familiar surroundings, away from the unknown dangers of that foreign city. I vowed to be more cautious in the future, to trust my instincts, and to never underestimate the potential risks of traveling alone. It took time to shake off the fear, the sense of being hunted. I kept the note as a reminder of how quickly things could escalate, of the thin line between safety and danger in unfamiliar places. Looking back, I still don't know who was after me or why. Maybe I never will. But I learned valuable lessons about vigilance, about trusting my instincts, and about the importance of staying safe, no matter where I am. I was working a late shift at the diner, and it was one of those slow nights where time seemed to drag. Around 9 p.m., an order came in for delivery. The address was an isolated house on the outskirts of town, a good 20-minute drive from the diner. It was an odd place for a delivery, but I didn't think much of it. I grabbed the food, hopped into my car, and set off. The drive was uneventful at first. The roads were quiet, and the streetlights became fewer and farther between as I drove out of town. After a while, I turned onto a narrow, winding road that led deeper into the countryside. The only light came from my headlights, and the trees on either side of the road loomed like dark sentinels. When I finally reached the house, it was even more isolated than I expected. It was an old, two-story building with peeling paint and a sagging porch. I parked my car and walked up to the front door, food in hand. I knocked, and after a moment, the door creaked open. A man stood there, staring at me with an intense expression. He was tall and thin, with unkempt hair and a scruffy beard. "Delivery from the diner," I said, trying to sound cheerful. He nodded and stepped aside, gesturing for me to come in. As soon as I crossed the threshold, he shut the door behind me with a loud thud. The sound echoed through the empty house, and I felt a chill run down my spine. He led me into the living room, which was sparsely furnished and dimly lit. "Wait here," he said, his voice low and rough. He disappeared into another room, and I stood there, clutching the bag of food, feeling increasingly uneasy. Minutes passed, and the man didn't return. I started to get nervous. I set the food down on a dusty table and glanced around the room. The windows were covered with heavy curtains, and there was an oppressive silence in the air. Something didn't feel right. I decided to call out. "Sir, your food's getting cold." There was no response. I took a tentative step towards the doorway he had disappeared through. Just as I was about to call out again, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around to see the man standing there, holding a gun. "Sit down," he said, his voice cold and menacing. My heart pounded in my chest as I slowly lowered myself onto the couch. He kept the gun pointed at me, his eyes boring into mine. "Do you know why you're here?" he asked. I shook my head, my mind racing. "No, I don't." He sneered. "Your boss. He ruined my life. And now you're going to help me get back at him." He started pacing, still holding the gun. He ranted about how the diner owner had cheated him, driven him to bankruptcy, and destroyed his family. His words were filled with anger and bitterness. I tried to stay calm, but fear was clawing at me from the inside. I needed to find a way out, but he was unpredictable and armed. I glanced around the room, looking for anything that might help me. He noticed. "Don't even think about trying anything," he warned, waving the gun for emphasis. "You're not leaving here until I've had my revenge." I took a deep breath, trying to think clearly. "Look, I just deliver the food. I don't know anything about what happened between you and my boss. But maybe we can figure something out." He shook his head, his grip on the gun tightening. "No. You're just a pawn. But your boss, he'll pay for what he did." He continued pacing, muttering to himself. I knew I had to act fast. I noticed a heavy lamp on the side table within reach. It was my only chance. I waited for him to turn his back, then lunged for the lamp and swung it at him with all my strength. The lamp connected with his head, and he staggered, dropping the gun. I didn't wait to see if he was down for good. I grabbed the gun and ran for the door, my heart racing. I fumbled with the lock, my hand shaking, but finally managed to get it open. I sprinted to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were trembling so badly it took 2 tries to get the key into the ignition. I started the car and sped down the driveway, gravel flying behind me. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man stumble out onto the porch, clutching his head. I drove back to town as fast as I could, my mind a whirlwind of fear and adrenaline. When I reached the diner, I called the police and told them everything. They arrived quickly and went out to the house. They found the man still there, disoriented and bleeding from the head wound. He was arrested and taken into custody. It was only then that I allowed myself to break down, the full weight of what had happened hitting me. I was safe, but the fear and tension of those moments stayed with me long after. The diner owner thanked me for my bravery, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped a much worse fate. We decided to take a family camping trip to the Redwoods in California. It was just me, my wife, and our 2 kids. We thought it would be a good way to spend some quality time together, away from the city and all the noise. The first couple of days were perfect. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, and told stories around the campfire. The kids loved it. The trees were massive, and everything felt peaceful. But on the 3rd night, things started to get strange. It was around midnight when I first heard the noises. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe a raccoon or a deer. But then I heard voices. Low, whispering voices. I got out of the tent to take a look. I couldn't see anything, but the feeling that someone was watching us was overwhelming. The next morning, I found footprints around our campsite. They were too big to be from any of us. I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was probably just other campers passing through. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I kept the fire going longer than usual. I wanted to make sure I could see if anyone approached. Around 2 a.m., I heard the voices again, closer this time. I quietly got out of the tent and grabbed the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but I still couldn't see anyone. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind me. I spun around, and there they were. 3 men, dirty and wild-eyed, standing just outside the circle of light. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew right away these weren't ordinary campers. One of them stepped forward and smiled. "Nice night, isn't it?" he said, but there was nothing friendly about his tone. I didn't know what to do. My wife and kids were still sleeping, and I didn't want to scare them, but I knew I had to do something. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just looking for a place to stay," the man replied. "Mind if we join you?" I knew this wasn't a request. I shook my head. "I think it's best if you move along. We're just here with our kids, trying to have a quiet trip." The man's smile faded. "Oh, we insist," he said, stepping closer. The other two men spread out, flanking me. I glanced back at the tent. My wife was peeking out, her eyes wide with fear. I knew I had to protect them. "You need to leave, now," I said, louder this time. The man's face twisted in anger. "I don't think you understand," he said. "We're not going anywhere." One of the other men lunged at me, but I managed to dodge and push him away. "Wake up the kids and get to the car," I shouted to my wife. She scrambled to wake the kids while I tried to hold off the men. They were stronger than me, and I could feel my strength fading. But I had to buy them time. I heard my wife scream as she bundled the kids into the car. I took a punch to the gut and doubled over, but I didn't let go of my flashlight. I swung it wildly, hitting one of the men in the face. He fell back, cursing. "Go! Go!" I yelled, stumbling towards the car. The men were right behind me. I could hear their footsteps, their heavy breathing. We managed to get into the car and lock the doors just as they reached us. My wife fumbled with the keys, her hands shaking. The men pounded on the windows, shouting and threatening us. Finally, the engine roared to life. We sped out of the campsite, the men chasing us for a few yards before giving up. My wife drove as fast as she could, not stopping until we reached a small town several miles away. We went straight to the police. They took our statement and told us there had been reports of escaped convicts in the area. They assured us they would search the woods, but I knew I'd never feel safe camping again. That night, in the safety of a motel room, I held my family close. We were lucky to be alive. I always wanted a classic car. It was a dream of mine for years. So, when I found one for sale in Philadelphia, I jumped at the chance. It was a 1967 Mustang, in pretty good shape, and the price was reasonable. The seller, a guy named Mike, seemed nice enough. He was eager to sell and told me he needed the money quickly. I didn't ask too many questions. I met Mike at a rundown garage on the outskirts of town. The place looked abandoned, but the Mustang was there, gleaming under a layer of dust. We made the deal, and he handed over the keys. I drove the car home, feeling like I had just scored the deal of a lifetime. The first sign of trouble came the next day. I was at a red light when a black SUV pulled up beside me. The window rolled down, and a guy inside stared at me, hard. I looked away, trying to ignore him, but I could feel his eyes burning into me. The light turned green, and I drove off quickly, but the SUV followed me for several blocks before finally turning away. That night, I heard noises outside my house. It sounded like someone was messing with the car. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check, but by the time I got outside, no one was there. The car was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. A few days later, I was driving to work when the SUV appeared again. This time, it was right on my tail. I tried to lose them, weaving through traffic, but they stayed with me. Finally, I pulled into a crowded parking lot and ran inside a store, hoping they wouldn't follow. They didn't, but when I came back out, there was a note on my windshield. It said, "We know who you are. I decided to call Mike. His phone went straight to voicemail. I tried a few more times, but no luck. I started to get really worried. That evening, I noticed the SUV parked down the street from my house. They were watching me. The next morning, I found my tires slashed. I called a tow truck and had the car taken to a nearby garage. The mechanic told me it would take a few days to get new tires and fix some other minor issues. I felt a bit of relief, thinking maybe things would calm down without the car around. But that night, someone broke into my house. I woke up to the sound of shattering glass and footsteps downstairs. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept down the stairs, heart pounding. There were two men in my living room, rummaging through my stuff. They saw me and one of them lunged. I swung the bat, hitting him in the side. He went down, but the other guy pulled a knife. I backed up, trying to keep the bat between us. He slashed at me, and I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I swung the bat again, hitting his arm and knocking the knife away. He tackled me, and we both went down hard. I managed to get on top of him and hit him again until he stopped moving. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived within minutes and arrested the two men. I was taken to the hospital, where I got stitches for the cut on my arm. The police questioned me about the men, but I didn't know anything. They took my statement and promised to look into it. A few days later, I got a call from a detective. He told me that the men who broke into my house were part of a gang, and they were looking for something they thought Mike had left in the car. He wouldn't say what, but it sounded serious. The detective advised me to stay somewhere safe until they could sort things out. I stayed with a friend for a while, hoping the police would catch the rest of the gang. They kept the Mustang as evidence, which was fine by me. I didn't want anything to do with it anymore. Eventually, the police busted the gang, and things started to calm down. They returned the car, but I sold it as soon as I could. I didn't want any more trouble. I live in a small town in Utah, where everyone knows everyone else. It's the kind of place where people are friendly, maybe a little too friendly sometimes. That's what I thought about the mechanic, Tom, who worked at the auto shop just down the road from my house. He always had a smile on his face and a joke ready, but there was something about the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. I first started getting suspicious when I took my car in for a routine oil change. Tom was friendly enough, asking about my job and where I lived. But then he started asking more personal questions, like if I lived alone and what I did on the weekends. It made me uncomfortable, but I brushed it off as small talk. A few days later, I noticed Tom driving past my house. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I started seeing him more often, always lingering nearby whenever I went out. It was like he was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it got under my skin. One night, I was working late in my garage when I heard footsteps outside. I peeked through the window and saw Tom standing there, staring at me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I asked him what he was doing there, but he just smiled and said he was passing by. I didn't believe him. After that, I started noticing things missing from my garage, small tools and equipment that I knew I had left out. I couldn't prove it was Tom, but I had a feeling he was somehow involved. I started locking up tighter, checking all the doors and windows before I went to bed. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying to break into my house. I grabbed a baseball bat and crept downstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw Tom outside, trying to force open the back door. I yelled at him to leave, but he just laughed and kept trying. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, Tom was gone. They took a report, but there wasn't much they could do without evidence. I felt helpless, like I was being hunted in my own home. The next day, I went to the auto shop to confront Tom. I demanded to know why he was stalking me and trying to break into my house. At first, he denied it, but when I threatened to go to the police again, he confessed. He said he had become obsessed with me, watching me from afar and fantasizing about being with me. He thought if he could just get close enough, I would fall in love with him. It sent a shiver down my spine, knowing how close I had come to being harmed by someone I thought I could trust. I moved out of that town as soon as I could, never looking back. I still have nightmares about Tom and what could have happened if I hadn't caught him in time. I had been exploring the vast woods of Maine for a few days. The silence and beauty of nature were all I needed to clear my head. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape from my stressful job. I had a small cabin rented for the week, far from any town or other people. One afternoon, while hiking deeper into the forest, I heard a faint cry. It sounded like a child. My heart started pounding as I rushed toward the sound. After a few minutes, I found a small boy lying on the ground, clutching his leg. He looked about 8 years old, with dirt-smeared cheeks and tears in his eyes. I knelt beside him and asked if he was okay. He said he had fallen and hurt his leg. I offered to carry him back to my cabin, but he insisted he needed to get back to his family. Against my better judgment, I agreed to follow him. He led me deeper into the woods, further from any paths I recognized. After what felt like an hour, we arrived at a rundown shack hidden among the trees. I had a bad feeling, but the boy seemed desperate. As we approached, the door creaked open and a man stepped out. He was tall and unkempt, with a wild look in his eyes. Behind him, 2 more men emerged, equally rough-looking. "Who are you?" the first man demanded. I explained what had happened, hoping they were just a strange, reclusive family. The man's expression softened slightly as he looked at the boy. "That's my nephew," he said, but there was something off in his tone. Before I could react, one of the other men grabbed my arm. "You're coming inside," he said gruffly. Panic surged through me as they pulled me into the shack. The interior was dark and smelled of mildew. There were makeshift beds and empty cans scattered around. It looked like they had been living there for a while. The man who seemed to be in charge shoved me into a corner and demanded to know if I had told anyone I was coming here. I lied and said no one knew. He eyed me suspiciously but seemed to believe me for the moment. The boy sat quietly on one of the beds, avoiding my gaze. I realized he must have been coerced into luring me here. The men started talking among themselves in hushed tones, occasionally glancing my way. I caught bits and pieces about being on the run and needing to move again. I knew I had to escape, but they were watching me closely. The windows were boarded up, and the door was the only exit. I needed to find a way to distract them. My chance came when one of the men left to fetch water, and the others seemed to relax a bit. I told them I needed to use the bathroom, hoping they had one inside. The leader pointed to a small, filthy room at the back. I went in and locked the door, my mind racing. There was a small window, but it was too high and narrow to climb through. I noticed a rusty old mirror hanging on the wall and an idea struck me. I smashed the mirror, breaking off a shard to use as a weapon. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door and walked back into the main room. The men were startled by the noise, and I saw the leader's eyes widen when he saw the shard in my hand. "Stay back," I warned, my voice shaking. The leader laughed, but it was a nervous laugh. I took a step forward, brandishing the shard. The other man moved to grab me, but I slashed at him, catching his arm. He yelped in pain and stumbled back. In the commotion, the boy ran to my side. "This way," he whispered, pulling me toward the back of the shack. We slipped out through a narrow door that led to a small clearing. I could hear the men shouting behind us. We ran through the woods, branches scratching our skin. The boy seemed to know where he was going, and I followed him blindly. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could hear the men crashing through the forest behind us. Eventually, we reached a small river. The boy led me to a hidden path that ran alongside it. We followed the path until we came to an old, abandoned cabin. We hid inside, trying to catch our breath. The boy explained that he and his mother had been taken by the men a few months ago. His mother had tried to escape and was killed. He had been too scared to run until now. We stayed hidden until nightfall, then made our way back to my cabin. I called the police and reported everything. They arrived quickly, and a search party was sent out. The men were eventually caught, and the boy was taken into protective custody. The experience left me shaken. The woods, which had once felt so peaceful, now seemed filled with hidden dangers. I cut my trip short and returned home. I decided to go backpacking in the Swiss Alps. It was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the time and savings to make it happen. The scenery was incredible, and the weather was perfect. I spent the first few days hiking through valleys and over mountain passes, enjoying the solitude and the beauty of the landscape. On the fourth day, I met another solo hiker. His name was Lucas, or at least that's what he told me. He was around my age, mid-30s, with short brown hair and a friendly demeanor. We started talking and ended up hiking together for most of the day. He seemed knowledgeable about the area and even gave me some tips on where to camp and which trails to take. We set up camp near a small lake that evening. Lucas seemed relaxed, and we shared stories about our travels and lives back home. He said he was from Germany and was taking some time off to explore the Alps. He had a charming way about him, and I felt at ease in his company. The next day, we continued hiking together. But as the day went on, I started to notice little things that didn't quite add up. He seemed to know too much about avoiding main trails and finding secluded spots. His gear was top-notch, almost like he was prepared for more than just a casual hike. That night, as we sat by the campfire, Lucas became more serious. He asked me if I had told anyone where I was going or when I planned to return. It seemed like an odd question, but I didn't think much of it at the time. I told him I had given my itinerary to a friend back home. The next morning, I woke up to find Lucas already awake and packing his things. He looked tense, and his friendly demeanor was gone. He told me he needed to move quickly and that it was best if we split up. I was confused but agreed, thinking maybe he just wanted to hike alone again. As I packed my own gear, I noticed my wallet was missing. Panic set in. I confronted Lucas, but he denied taking it. I didn't believe him, but I was alone in the mountains with no way to prove it. I decided to leave and head back to a more populated area as quickly as possible. I hiked for hours, trying to put as much distance between us as I could. But around midday, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned to see Lucas approaching. He had a desperate look in his eyes. He admitted he had taken my wallet and begged me to help him. He said he was in trouble and needed a new identity to escape. He was a fugitive, wanted for something he wouldn't specify. I was terrified. Here was this man, someone I had thought of as a friend, revealing he was on the run and willing to do anything to stay free. He pleaded with me to switch identities, to take his documents and give him mine. I refused, knowing it was a bad idea, but he became agitated. He grabbed my arm and tried to take my backpack. I struggled, but he was stronger. I managed to break free and ran down the trail, my heart pounding. I could hear him chasing me, yelling at me to stop. I didn't look back, just kept running as fast as I could. Eventually, I came to a small village. I ran to the nearest building, which turned out to be a small inn, and begged the owner to call the police. The owner saw the fear in my eyes and immediately called. Lucas arrived a few minutes later, but the innkeeper stood between us, telling him to leave. Lucas hesitated, then turned and walked away. The police arrived soon after. I told them everything. They took my statement and searched the area but couldn't find Lucas. They assured me they would continue looking, but I knew he was long gone. They helped me get a replacement ID and enough money to get back home. I finished my trip early and returned home, shaken but safe. The experience left me wary of strangers, and I still get anxious when I think about it. The Swiss Alps were supposed to be a peaceful escape, but instead, they became the backdrop to the most terrifying experience of my life. I'm just grateful I managed to get out of there alive. It was supposed to be a simple trip. Tom and I were driving through Nevada, and we were getting tired. The sun was setting, and we needed a place to stay for the night. We found a cheap motel by the highway. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the parking lot. It looked run down, but we were too exhausted to be picky. We walked into the office, where a man with greasy hair and a stained shirt greeted us. His smile was off, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. He handed us the key to room 12 and gave us directions. We thanked him and walked to our room. The room was small and smelled musty. The bed looked clean enough, but there were stains on the carpet and the walls had peeling paint. We decided to make the best of it. We unpacked a few things and settled in. Tom turned on the TV, but it only had static. We laughed it off, trying to keep our spirits up. As we were getting ready for bed, I noticed a dark stain on the floor near the bathroom door. I got closer and realized it was blood. My heart started pounding. I called Tom over, and he confirmed my worst fear. It was definitely blood. We stood there, trying to make sense of it. Tom suggested we go back to the office and report it. I agreed, so we locked the room and headed back. The man at the desk seemed annoyed when we told him about the blood stain. He insisted it was nothing, probably just an old stain that hadn't been cleaned properly. He offered to give us a different room, but something felt wrong. We decided to stay in room 12 and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. As we walked back, we noticed there were no other cars in the parking lot. It was strange, considering it was a busy highway. We shrugged it off and went back inside. We locked the door and pushed a chair against it, just to be safe. We tried to sleep, but every noise outside made us jump. Around midnight, we heard footsteps outside our room. They stopped right in front of our door. We held our breath, waiting. After a few minutes, the footsteps moved away. Tom whispered that we should leave. I agreed. We quickly packed our bags and quietly opened the door. The hallway was empty. We made our way to the car, trying to stay as quiet as possible. As we reached the car, we heard a door creak open behind us. We turned and saw the motel owner standing there, watching us. His eyes were dark, and his smile was gone. He didn't say anything, just stood there. We jumped into the car and sped off, leaving the motel behind. My heart was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we had just escaped something terrible. We drove for a while until we found a diner that was open 24 hours. We went inside, ordered coffee, and tried to calm down. We talked about what had happened and decided to call the police. We told them about the bloodstain and the strange behavior of the motel owner. They said they would send someone to check it out. The next morning, we received a call from the police. They found more bloodstains in room 12 and other rooms. They also found evidence that suggested the previous occupants had never checked out. The motel owner was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. The police thanked us for reporting it and said we had likely saved lives by doing so. The experience left us shaken. We couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if we had stayed. I'm the keeper of a lighthouse, and let me tell you about the scariest night of my life. It was during a storm, one of those really bad ones that rattles the windows and shakes the whole building. I was up in the tower, doing my usual rounds and keeping an eye on the sea. That's when I saw it, a shipwrecked sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood, desperately trying to stay afloat in the churning waters. My heart went out to him, knowing that he was in serious trouble out there. So I did what any decent person would do. I let him in. I guided him up to the lighthouse, trying to be a good Samaritan and offer him shelter from the storm. But as soon as he stepped inside, I knew that something was wrong. There was something about him, something in his eyes that set off alarm bells in my head. He was hostile from the start, demanding food and shelter like he owned the place. I tried to reason with him, to tell him that I was just trying to help. But he wasn't having any of it, getting more aggressive by the minute. I knew I had to do something to protect myself and the lighthouse from this dangerous man. So I tried to reason with him, to calm him down and get him to see reason. But he wasn't interested in listening, too caught up in his own anger and frustration. That's when he made his move, lunging at me with a knife in his hand. I barely had time to react, dodging out of the way and trying to defend myself as best as I could. It was like something out of a nightmare, like I was trapped in some kind of horror movie. I managed to grab hold of a nearby lamp and swing it at him, knocking him off balance and giving me enough time to make a run for it. I didn't stop running until I was miles away from the lighthouse, until I was sure that he couldn't follow me anymore. I called for help as soon as I could, telling them what had happened and begging them to come and get me. It felt like hours before they finally arrived, like I was trapped in some kind of endless nightmare. But eventually they found me, and they took me back to safety. I never found out what happened to that sailor, whether they caught him or whether he managed to slip away into the night. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night for as long as I live. It was the scariest thing that's ever happened to me, and it's something that I hope I never have to experience again. I was on a road trip, cruising down backcountry roads with no particular destination in mind. I was running low on fuel, so I pulled into this remote gas station in the middle of nowhere. As I stepped inside, I immediately felt eyes on me. There were a group of locals hanging out by the counter, talking in hushed whispers. They stopped as soon as I walked in, turning to stare at me with intense curiosity. I tried to ignore them, focusing on filling up my tank and getting back on the road. But they seemed overly eager to strike up a conversation, asking me where I was headed and if I needed any help. I felt a growing sense of unease as they crowded around me, their smiles too wide and their eyes too bright. It was like they were trying too hard to be friendly, like they had something to hide. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But as I paid for my gas and made my way back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As I pulled out of the gas station, I noticed a car following me. It was one of the locals from the gas station, tailing me closely as I drove down the deserted back roads. I tried to lose them, taking a series of sharp turns and detours, but they stayed right on my tail. I started to panic, wondering what they wanted from me and why they were following me. I considered pulling over and confronting them, but something told me it wouldn't end well. So, I kept driving, hoping to find help or a way to escape. But no matter how fast I drove or how many turns I took, they stayed right behind me, like they were toying with me, leading me deeper into the wilderness. I felt like a trapped animal, with nowhere to run and no one to turn to for help. I knew I had to do something, anything, to get away from them. Finally, I spotted a turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading off into the trees. Without thinking, I slammed on the brakes and swerved onto the dirt road, praying it would lead me to safety. As I drove deeper into the forest, the car following me fell further and further behind. I breathed a sigh of relief, grateful to have escaped whatever danger they posed. I drove for hours, not stopping until I was safely back on the main road, far away from that remote gas station and the locals who had tried to trap me. I'm a travel blogger, always on the lookout for the next great adventure to share with my readers. So when I heard about the abandoned ghost towns of the American West, I knew I had to see them for myself. Armed with my camera and a sense of excitement, I set out on a road trip to document these forgotten places, eager to uncover their secrets and share them with the world. But as I arrived at my first destination, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. The town seemed deserted at first glance, but there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to push aside my fears and focus on my mission, but the sense of foreboding only grew stronger as I explored the empty streets and dilapidated buildings. And then, as I rounded a corner, I saw them. A group of figures lurking in the shadows, their eyes following my every move with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Were these the former inhabitants of the town, still lingering here long after everyone else had gone? I tried to approach them, to see if they needed help or if they could tell me what had happened to the town. But as I drew closer, I could see that there was something not quite right about them. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, like they were marionettes being controlled by some unseen force. And their eyes, empty and lifeless, seemed to stare right through me with a malevolence that sent a shiver down my spine. I knew I needed to get out of there, to escape before whatever had taken hold of the town turned its sights on me. But as I turned to leave, I heard a voice calling out to me from the darkness. It was a woman's voice, soft and melodic, but there was something wrong about it, something that made my skin crawl. She was asking for help, begging me to stay and keep her company in this lonely place. I tried to ignore her and keep walking, but her voice followed me, growing louder and more insistent with each step I took. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw her. She emerged from the shadows, her face twisted into a grotesque mockery of a smile as she reached out to me with hands that seemed to be made of something other than flesh and bone. I screamed and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I fled through the empty streets. But no matter how fast I ran, the town seemed to stretch on forever, its twisted alleys and crumbling buildings like a maze from which there was no escape. I stumbled and fell, scraping my hands and knees on the rough pavement as I scrambled to my feet and kept running. But no matter how far I went, the woman was always right behind me, her voice echoing in my ears like a nightmare that wouldn't end. I knew I had to find a way out, to escape this hellish place before it consumed me whole. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I saw it. A break in the buildings, a sliver of moonlight shining down from above. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted towards it, my lungs burning with exertion as I fought to reach safety. And then, just as I reached the edge of the town, I felt her hand close around my ankle, pulling me back into the darkness with a strength that seemed impossible for someone so frail. I screamed and kicked, lashing out with all the strength I had left as I fought to break free. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I felt her grip loosen, her fingers slipping away as I tumbled out of her grasp and into the waiting arms of a stranger. I collapsed into their embrace, gasping for breath as they helped me to my feet and led me away from the town and the horrors that lurked within its shadowy streets. We planned our camping trip to the Adirondacks for months. It was supposed to be a fun getaway, just me and my two best friends, Jake and Sam. We arrived late afternoon, set up our tents, and got a fire going. It was perfect. We cooked dinner, shared some beers, and talked until the stars came out. The woods were peaceful, just the sounds of nature around us. We went to bed around midnight, excited for a day of hiking and exploring. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. It was quiet, too quiet. I could hear something outside, the sound of someone moving around. At first, I thought it was an animal, but then I heard whispers. My heart started pounding. I nudged Jake, who was in the tent with me, and whispered that I heard something. He listened and heard it too. We both sat there, straining to hear what was going on. We decided to peek out of the tent. What we saw made my blood run cold. There were two men, strangers, rummaging through our gear. They were dressed in dark clothes, and one of them had a knife. I could see Sam's tent was unzipped, and he was still asleep. I motioned for Jake to stay quiet. We had no idea who these guys were or what they wanted. Jake and I exchanged looks, trying to figure out what to do. We didn't have any weapons, just some kitchen knives and a hatchet we brought for chopping wood. We didn't want to confront them directly, but we couldn't just sit there and let them take our stuff or hurt Sam. We decided to wake Sam up quietly. I crawled over to his tent and gently shook him awake. He looked confused but stayed silent when he saw the situation. We whispered a quick plan. We would try to scare them off, make them think there were more of us or that we were armed. We gathered our courage and stepped out of the tents, making as much noise as possible. Jake grabbed the hatchet and Sam picked up a heavy branch. I held a flashlight, shining it directly at the men. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The two men froze, then turned to face us. One of them smirked and stepped forward, the knife glinting in the flashlight beam. "We're just taking what we need," he said, his voice low and menacing. "You got a problem with that?" My heart was pounding, and I could barely think straight. "Yeah, we have a problem," Jake said, holding the hatchet up. "Get the hell out of here before things get ugly." The second man, who had been silent, suddenly lunged at Sam, knocking the branch out of his hands. Sam fell backward, and the man stood over him, ready to strike. Jake and I reacted without thinking. I swung the flashlight at the first man's face, and Jake charged at the second man with the hatchet raised. The flashlight connected, and the man staggered back, cursing. Jake tackled the second man, and they both went down in a heap. Sam scrambled to his feet and grabbed the branch again, swinging it wildly. The situation was chaos. The men fought back hard, and it was clear they were used to this kind of thing. Somehow, we managed to get the upper hand. The first man, bleeding from a cut on his forehead, stumbled away, shouting for his friend to retreat. The second man kicked Jake off and ran after his partner, both of them disappearing into the darkness. We stood there, breathing hard, adrenaline pumping, unsure if they were really gone or just regrouping. We quickly gathered our gear, packing up as fast as we could. We decided it was too dangerous to stay. We didn't know if those guys would come back with more people or weapons. The hike back to the car in the dark was tense, every sound making us jump. When we finally reached the car, we piled in and locked the doors. None of us spoke much on the drive back, still shaken from the encounter. We reported the incident to the park rangers the next day, but we never found out who those men were or why they targeted us. That trip changed everything. The woods didn't feel safe anymore. We still go camping, but we're more cautious now. We never go unarmed, and we always stay in places where there are other people around. That night in the Adirondacks was the scariest experience of my life, and I'm just glad we made it out alive. I had been driving all day through the Midwest, just looking for a place to rest for the night. I spotted a small, secluded motel off the highway and decided it was as good a place as any to stop. It looked old and kind of run down, but I was too tired to be picky. I parked my car and went into the office. The manager was an older guy, seemed friendly enough, but there was something off about his eyes. He gave me a key to room 6 and told me to enjoy my stay. I nodded and headed to my room, trying not to overthink it. The room was what I expected, small, with outdated furniture and a musty smell. I locked the door behind me and dropped my bag on the bed. After a quick shower, I lay down, hoping to get some sleep. I turned on the TV to drown out the silence. The local news was on, and they were talking about a serial killer in the area, targeting motel guests. My heart skipped a beat. They said the killer had struck at a few motels nearby, and the police were advising travelers to be cautious. I turned off the TV and tried to shake off the unease. It was probably just my imagination running wild. I locked the door and checked the windows, making sure everything was secure. Then I lay back down, telling myself I'd be fine. As night fell, I started hearing strange noises outside. At first, it was just rustling, like the wind in the trees. But then I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate. My pulse quickened. I got up and looked out the window, but it was too dark to see anything clearly. I tried to calm myself down. It could be another guest, or maybe the manager making his rounds. But the footsteps didn't go away. They seemed to be getting closer. I backed away from the window and grabbed my phone, ready to call for help if I needed to. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, listening intently. Then there was a soft knock. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I didn't move, hoping whoever it was would go away. But the knocking continued, more insistent this time. I had to do something. I quietly moved to the door and looked through the peephole. There was no one there. I frowned, confused. Maybe it was just a prank. I turned to go back to bed, but then I heard the doorknob rattle. Someone was trying to get in. Panic surged through me. I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob, hoping it would hold. The rattling stopped, and everything went silent again. I sat on the edge of the bed, clutching my phone. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? I didn't even see who it was. I decided to wait it out and see if the noises stopped. Minutes felt like hours. I heard more footsteps, moving away from my door and down the hall. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady my nerves. Maybe whoever it was had given up and left. Just as I was starting to relax, there was a loud bang on my window. I jumped, nearly dropping my phone. I crept to the window and peered out. In the darkness, I could just make out a shadowy figure standing there, watching me. Fear gripped me. I knew I couldn't stay here. I grabbed my bag and quietly opened the door, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty. I slipped out and made my way to the parking lot, sticking to the shadows. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking. I finally got the door open and jumped in, locking the doors behind me. I started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, not daring to look back. I drove until I found another motel, this one a bit more populated. I checked in and locked myself in the room, double-checking all the locks and windows. It was only then that I allowed myself to breathe. I never did find out who was outside my room that night, or if it was really the serial killer the news had talked about. But I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be staying in any secluded motels again. I was driving through the Midwest, on my way to visit family. It was a long drive, and I needed a break, so I pulled into a rest area. It was one of those desolate places, just a couple of picnic tables and a bathroom, surrounded by flat, empty land. There were only a few other cars around, most of them parked far from each other. I got out, stretched my legs, and decided to use the restroom. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something odd. There was a truck parked off to the side, away from the other vehicles. The back of the truck was slightly open, and I thought I heard a faint noise coming from inside. It sounded like someone crying. I walked a little closer, trying not to be too obvious. The crying got louder, and I could make out words. It was a woman's voice, begging for help. My heart started pounding. I knew something was very wrong. I looked around, but there was no one else in sight. I had to make a decision quickly. I couldn't just leave her there. I took a deep breath and approached the truck. As I got closer, I could see through the gap in the back. There was a woman inside, tied up and gagged. She looked terrified. I tried to open the door quietly, but it creaked loudly. The woman's eyes widened, and she started shaking her head, trying to warn me. Before I could react, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around and saw 3 men walking towards me. They didn't look friendly. "What do you think you're doing?" one of them asked, his voice low and threatening. He was tall and muscular, with a scar running down his face. I tried to stay calm. "I heard someone crying. I was just checking if everything was okay." The man with the scar stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Everything's fine. Mind your own business." I knew I had to get out of there, but I couldn't just leave the woman. I took a step back, trying to think of a plan. The men must have sensed my hesitation because they closed in on me, cutting off my escape route. "Look, I don't want any trouble," I said, raising my hands. "Just let the woman go, and I'll leave." The man with the scar laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "It's too late for that." Before I could react, he lunged at me, grabbing my arm. I tried to pull away, but he was too strong. The other 2 men grabbed me, pinning my arms behind my back. I struggled, but it was no use. They dragged me to the truck and threw me inside with the woman. She was crying harder now, her eyes full of fear. The men shut the door, plunging us into darkness. I could hear them talking outside, their voices muffled. I turned to the woman, trying to untie her gag. "We're going to get out of here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure how. My mind was racing, trying to come up with a plan. The knots were tight, but I managed to loosen them enough to pull the gag off. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They're dangerous. We have to get out of here." I nodded, my heart pounding, I could hear the men outside, arguing about what to do with us. I knew we didn't have much time. I felt around in the darkness, looking for anything that could help us escape. My fingers brushed against a metal tool, maybe a tire iron. I grabbed it, hoping it would be enough. The door suddenly swung open, and the light blinded me for a moment. One of the men climbed in, his face twisted in anger. "Time to shut you up," he growled, reaching for the woman. I swung the tire iron with all my strength, hitting him in the side of the head. He stumbled back, cursing. I didn't wait for him to recover. I grabbed the woman's hand and pulled her out of the truck. We ran towards my car, but the other two men were already coming after us. I could hear their footsteps pounding on the pavement, getting closer. I fumbled with my keys, trying to unlock the door. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get the key into the lock. Finally, the door opened, and we both scrambled inside. I locked the doors and started the engine, my heart racing. The men reached the car just as I pulled away, pounding on the windows and shouting. I floored the gas pedal, speeding out of the rest area. My mind was in a blur as I drove, trying to put as much distance between us and them as possible. The woman was sobbing beside me, her hands shaking. "Thank you," she kept saying. "Thank you." We drove for what felt like hours, not daring to slow down. Eventually, we reached a small town and pulled into a gas station. I called the police and told them everything. They sent officers to the rest area, but by the time they got there, the men were gone. The woman told me her name was Emily. She had been kidnapped a few days earlier and didn't know where they were taking her. The police took our statements and promised to do everything they could to find the men. It was a long, terrifying night, but we were safe. I still have nightmares about what could have happened, but I'm grateful I stopped at that rest area. If I hadn't, Emily might still be out there, trapped in that truck. My name is Molly, and I thought you saw that I'm going to take a trip to Greece alone. My life was getting boring and I had some money saved, plus it was something I had always wanted to do, and I finally had the chance. The first few days were perfect. I explored Athens, visited the Acropolis, and enjoyed the local food. It was everything I hoped for and more. One morning, I woke up in my small hotel room, ready for another day of adventure. But when I looked around, I noticed something was off. My bag, which I had left on the chair, was gone. I checked the room thoroughly, thinking maybe I had misplaced it, but it was nowhere to be found. Panic set in. My passport, wallet, phone, everything was in that bag. I had no way to prove who I was or contact anyone for help. I went to the hotel reception, trying to stay calm. The receptionist looked concerned and called the local police for me. The police arrived and took my statement. They seemed sympathetic but not very hopeful. They told me that thefts like this were common in tourist areas. They advised me to go to the embassy to get a temporary passport. I thanked them and tried to stay positive, even though I felt completely lost. I walked to the American embassy, my heart racing. When I got there, I explained my situation to the staff. They asked for some details and filled out some forms. They said it would take a few days to process everything. I nodded, trying to hold back my frustration and fear. Without any money or identification, I had to rely on the embassy's resources. They gave me some cash and helped me find a new place to stay. It was a small hostel, not far from the embassy. I felt grateful but also vulnerable. Over the next few days, I stayed mostly in the hostel, too scared to venture far. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed threatening. I kept checking in with the embassy, hoping for some good news. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard footsteps outside my room. My heart pounded in my chest. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I slowly got up and crept to the door, peeking through the peephole. There was no one there. The next day, I decided to take a walk to clear my head. I needed to get out of the hostel, even just for a little while. As I walked through the streets, I felt a strange sensation, like I was being followed. I glanced over my shoulder, but no one seemed suspicious. I turned into a small cafe, hoping to find some comfort in a cup of coffee. As I sat there, I noticed a man at a nearby table, staring at me. He looked away when I met his gaze, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I quickly finished my coffee and left. On my way back to the hostel, I felt the same unease. I walked faster, constantly looking around. When I got back, I locked the door and tried to calm down. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. The next morning, I went to the embassy again. They told me my temporary passport was ready. Relief washed over me. I could finally go home. They arranged for a taxi to take me to the airport. As I packed my things, I couldn't wait to leave Greece and this nightmare behind. At the airport, I kept looking over my shoulder, afraid that someone might try to stop me. But everything went smoothly. I boarded the plane, took my seat, and let out a sigh of relief as the plane took off. I was finally going home. The whole experience left me shaken. I loved Greece, but the fear and anxiety I felt overshadowed everything else. I was traveling through the remote woods of Siberia, a place I'd always wanted to see. The untouched wilderness had a sort of haunting beauty to it, and the isolation was a strange mix of peaceful and unnerving. My trip was supposed to be an adventure, something to break the monotony of everyday life. I was alone, which added to the thrill. The weather was cold, as expected. Snow blanketed the ground, and the trees stood tall and silent. It was easy to get lost in thought while walking through those woods, and that's probably why I didn't notice them at first. When I did, it was too late. I stumbled upon a clearing, and there they were, 3 men, rough-looking, dirty, and clearly not supposed to be there. I froze, realizing my mistake. They saw me immediately. One of them shouted something in Russian, and before I could react, they were on me. They grabbed me, their hands rough and unforgiving. I struggled, but it was no use. They were too strong. They dragged me to their camp, a makeshift setup hidden deep in the forest. There was a fire burning, and around it were more men, all looking as rough as the ones who had captured me. I recognized the look in their eyes, desperation and danger. I had heard stories about escaped convicts in Siberia, but I never thought I would encounter them. Now, I was their prisoner. They tied my hands and pushed me to the ground near the fire. One of them, who seemed to be the leader, started talking to me in broken English. He demanded to know who I was and what I was doing there. I tried to explain that I was just a traveler, but he didn't seem to care. He laughed, a harsh, cruel sound, and said something to the others. They all laughed too. I realized then that my survival depended on keeping calm and finding a way out. I watched them carefully, noting how they interacted and who seemed to be in charge. The leader was the one to focus on. He was the key to my escape. They kept me tied up, giving me just enough food and water to keep me alive. Days passed in a blur of fear and planning. I pretended to be more helpless than I was, hoping they would underestimate me. They mostly ignored me, which gave me time to observe. I noticed that the leader kept the key to my restraints on a cord around his neck. I would have to get that key. One night, after they had drunk themselves into a stupor, I saw my chance. The leader was passed out near the fire, the key just within reach. I quietly shuffled over to him, my heart pounding in my chest. I managed to grab the key without waking him and quickly freed myself. I knew I had to act fast. I took a knife from one of the sleeping men and slipped into the darkness of the forest. The cold air hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, the snow crunching under my feet. The forest was disorienting in the dark, but I couldn't stop. I had to put as much distance between them and me as possible. I stumbled and fell several times, but I got back up, driven by the fear of what would happen if they caught me. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I saw lights in the distance. It was a small village, barely more than a few houses and a store. I made my way there, exhausted and freezing. I banged on the first door I came to, desperate for help. An old woman answered, her eyes widening in shock at the sight of me. I tried to explain what had happened, but I was so cold and tired that the words wouldn't come out right. She called for help, and soon I was surrounded by villagers. They took me in, giving me food and warmth. I learned later that the convicts had been caught not long after I escaped. The villagers had alerted the authorities, and they were captured without much resistance. The leader was the last to be found, hiding in a nearby cave. They told me I was lucky to be alive. I stayed in the village for a few days, recovering from my ordeal. The villagers were kind, and they helped me get back to civilization. I never thought I would be so grateful for simple things like a warm bed and a hot meal. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me appreciate life in a way I never had before. I learned the hard way how fragile our existence can be, and how quickly things can change. I moved to a small rural town in Montana to get away from the hustle and bustle of city life. It was quiet, peaceful, and just what I needed. The neighbors were friendly, but everyone mostly kept to themselves. My house was at the edge of town, surrounded by fields and a thick forest. One evening, as I was getting ready to go to bed, I noticed a van parked down the road. It wasn't a vehicle I recognized. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just someone visiting a neighbor. But the next morning, the van was still there. It made me a bit uneasy, but I went about my day. Over the next few days, I started seeing the van more often. It would be parked in different spots, but always within view of my house. Sometimes, I thought I could see someone sitting inside, but the windows were tinted, making it hard to tell. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. One night, I was sitting in my living room when I noticed the van again. This time, it was parked closer. My heart started to race. I decided to take a walk outside, hoping to get a better look without seeming suspicious. As I approached, the van's engine started, and it drove away slowly. I didn't get a good look at the driver. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. I kept looking out the window, expecting to see the van again. Around midnight, I finally drifted off, but my sleep was restless. I kept having dreams of being watched. The next morning, I called the local sheriff's office. They took down my information but didn't seem too concerned. Probably just someone passing through, they said. But I knew something was off. I could feel it in my gut. That evening, as the sun was setting, I saw the van again. This time, it was parked right across the street. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to confront whoever was inside. I grabbed a flashlight and a baseball bat and walked towards the van. As I got closer, the driver's side door opened and a man stepped out. He was tall and had a scruffy beard. "Can I help you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The man just stared at me for a moment before getting back into the van and driving off. I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Who was he? What did he want? That night, I made sure all my doors and windows were locked. I even pushed a heavy dresser in front of the front door, just in case. Around 2 a.m., I was woken up by a loud noise. It sounded like someone trying to force open a window. My heart pounded in my chest as I grabbed a baseball bat and crept towards the noise. I peeked through the curtains and saw the van parked in my driveway. 2 men were outside, one of them trying to pry open a window. I felt a surge of panic. I ran to my bedroom and grabbed my phone, dialing 911. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely press the buttons. 911, what's your emergency? There are men trying to break into my house, I whispered, trying to keep my voice low. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but I knew it would take time for them to get there. I could hear the men outside talking, their voices low and menacing. I decided to make a run for it. I slipped out the back door and into the woods, hoping they wouldn't notice me. I crouched behind a tree, my breath coming in short gasps. From my hiding spot, I could see the men moving around the house. They were trying to break down the front door now. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they could hear it. Finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. The men must have heard them too, because they quickly ran back to the van and sped off. I stayed hidden until the police arrived. When I finally came out, I was shaking all over. The officers took my statement and promised to patrol the area more frequently. They found signs of forced entry, but thankfully, nothing was stolen. The van was nowhere to be seen. For the next few days, I couldn't relax. Every little noise set me on edge. But the van didn't return. I installed a security system and even got a dog for added protection. It took a while, but I eventually started to feel safe again. I never found out who those men were or why they were watching me. I was living in Chicago with my baby daughter, Emma. Money was tight, so I turned to Craigslist to find a second-hand stroller. After a bit of searching, I found one that looked perfect and was within my budget. I contacted the seller, a woman named Susan, and we arranged to meet at her apartment. Susan's place was in a rougher part of town, but she seemed friendly enough. She showed me the stroller, which was in great condition. We chatted a bit about our kids, and she even gave me some baby clothes her daughter had outgrown. I paid her, thanked her, and headed home, feeling relieved to have found such a good deal. That night, I got a message from Susan, asking if I got home safely. It seemed a bit odd, but I replied that I had and thanked her again. Over the next few days, I noticed a car parked across the street from my apartment. It was always there, and I started feeling uneasy. One evening, as I was putting Emma to bed, I heard a noise outside my window. I looked out and saw a man standing by the car, staring up at my apartment. I quickly closed the blinds and called my friend, Lisa. She offered to come over and stay with me, but I told her it was probably nothing. The next day, I went to the grocery store, and when I came out, I saw the same car parked near mine. The man was sitting inside, watching me. My heart raced as I hurried to my car, locked the doors, and drove home as fast as I could. I knew something was very wrong. That night, I heard noises outside my window again. I peeked through the blinds and saw two men in my yard. They were trying to break into my car. I grabbed my phone and called the police. They arrived quickly, but the men were gone by the time they got there. The officers took my report and promised to patrol the area more often. The next day, I got a text from an unknown number. It said, "We know where you live. Don't call the cops again." I was terrified. I called Lisa and told her everything. She insisted I come stay with her for a while. I packed a bag for Emma and me, and we left that night. At Lisa's place, I felt a bit safer, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I didn't hear from Susan again, but I kept getting threatening texts from different numbers. I changed my phone number, but somehow they kept finding it. I knew I needed to do something. I went to the police again and told them everything. They took me seriously this time and assigned a detective to my case. He suggested I stay somewhere else for a while and promised to look into Susan and the men who had been stalking me. Lisa and I decided to go to our parents' cabin in Wisconsin. It was remote and felt like a safe place to hide. We stayed there for a few weeks, trying to get back to some sense of normalcy. The detective called me regularly with updates, but they hadn't found the men yet. One night, I woke up to the sound of a car outside the cabin. I looked out and saw the same car that had been parked outside my apartment. Panic set in as I grabbed Emma and woke Lisa. We called the police and hid in the bathroom, waiting for help to arrive. The police showed up and caught one of the men trying to break into the cabin. They arrested him, and after questioning him, they found out that Susan was part of a gang that used Craigslist to find new victims. They would lure people in with good deals, then target them for robbery or worse. With the information from the arrested man, the police were able to track down the rest of the gang, including Susan. They were all arrested and charged with multiple crimes. It was a long and stressful process, but I was relieved when they were finally behind bars. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of the city and took extra precautions to ensure our safety. I was driving through Wyoming on a road trip, just trying to clear my head. It was getting late, and I was too tired to keep going, so I decided to stop at a small motel just off the highway. The neon sign said vacancy. It looked a bit run down, but I didn't care. I just needed a place to sleep. I walked into the office, and there was a man behind the desk. He looked tired, with bags under his eyes and a cigarette hanging from his lips. He gave me a room key without much conversation. Room 12. I thanked him and walked to my room. The hallways were dimly lit, and everything smelled faintly of mildew. The room was basic: a bed, a small TV, and a bathroom that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. I threw my bag on the bed and decided to take a quick shower. As the hot water hit my skin, I felt some of the tension from driving all day start to melt away. After my shower, I laid on the bed and flipped through the channels on the TV, trying to find something to watch. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was woken up by a loud banging on my door. I looked at the clock. It was 2 a.m. My heart started racing. Who would be knocking on my door at this hour? I got up and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" I called out. "Police," a voice answered. "Open up." Confused and a little scared, I opened the door a crack. Two men stood there, flashing their badges. They looked rough, like they had been up all night. "We need to talk to you," one of them said. "Can we come in?" I let them in, my mind racing with what they could want. "Is there a problem, officers?" One of them, a tall guy with a scar on his cheek, looked at me with cold eyes. "We got a report that someone fitting your description was seen near the scene of a crime earlier tonight. We need to ask you a few questions." I was taken aback. There must be some mistake. I've been here all night. I just checked in a few hours ago. The other cop, shorter and stockier, looked around my room as if he was expecting to find something. "Mind if we take a look around?" he asked, but it didn't sound like a question. I nodded, feeling cornered. They started going through my things, rifling through my bag and checking the bathroom. I stood there, feeling helpless. After a few minutes, they seemed satisfied and turned back to me. "You're not in any trouble," the tall one said. "But we need you to come down to the station and answer a few questions, just to clear things up." I didn't want to go, but what choice did I have? "Okay," I said. "Let me grab my wallet." I reached for my wallet on the nightstand, but as I turned around, I caught a glimpse of the tall cop's face. He had a strange look in his eyes, something that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, the shorter one grabbed my arm and twisted it behind my back. The tall one pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Hey, what are you doing?" I shouted, struggling against them. "Just a precaution," the tall cop said, but his tone was menacing. They cuffed me and dragged me out of the room, ignoring my protests. They shoved me into the back of their squad car and started driving. My mind was racing. This didn't feel right. They weren't taking me to the station. We were heading out of town, into the dark, empty stretches of road. I tried to stay calm, thinking of a way out. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just a little detour," the tall cop said, glancing at me in the rearview mirror with that same cold look. The car finally stopped in a secluded area, far from any lights or buildings. They pulled me out and pushed me to the ground. My heart was pounding in my chest. I knew I was in serious trouble. "We can't let you go," the tall cop said. "You know too much." "But I don't know anything," I shouted. "You've got the wrong guy." They didn't listen. The shorter cop pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. But then, a miracle happened. I heard the sound of another car approaching. The cops looked at each other, panicked. "We have to go," the tall one said. They jumped into their car and sped off, leaving me cuffed and lying on the ground. The other car stopped, and a man got out. He was a truck driver who had seen the squad car and decided to check what was going on. He freed me from the cuffs and drove me to the nearest town, where I reported everything to the real police. It turned out those cops were part of a corrupt group involved in various illegal activities, and they thought I was a witness who could expose them. They were arrested and charged, but the whole experience left me shaken. We decided to go camping in the Texas Hill Country. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway for me and my friends, just a break from our busy lives. We found a spot by the river, secluded and peaceful. It seemed perfect. The first night was calm. We set up our tents, made a fire, and enjoyed the quiet. The stars were bright, and the sound of the river was soothing. We stayed up late, talking and laughing. There was no sign of trouble. The next day, we explored the area. The hill country was beautiful, with rolling hills and dense forests. We hiked, took photos, and swam in the river. Everything was going great until we returned to our campsite that evening. As we approached, we noticed something was off. Our tents were slashed, our food scattered, and our belongings thrown around. At first, we thought it might have been an animal, but then we saw the message. Spray painted on a rock near our campsite with the words, "Go home." We were shaken but decided it was probably just a prank. We cleaned up the mess and decided to stay one more night. After all, we had traveled a long way, and it didn't seem right to leave because of a few vandals. That night, we built another fire and tried to relax. But the atmosphere had changed. The woods felt different, more threatening. We were on edge, jumping at every sound. Around midnight, we heard voices. At first, it was just a murmur, but it grew louder. There were people out there, just beyond the light of our fire. We couldn't see them, but we knew they were watching us. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. There was no answer, just a low, menacing laugh. My friends and I huddled closer together, fear gripping us. The voices continued, taunting us, making crude jokes about what they were going to do to us. We decided it was time to leave. We packed up as quickly as we could, but it was hard to see in the dark, and we were fumbling with our gear. Just as we were about to leave, one of the men stepped into the light. He was tall, with a scruffy beard and a mean look in his eyes. "You folks lost?" he asked, a cruel smile on his face. "We're just leaving," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good idea," he said. "This ain't a place for outsiders." More men appeared, surrounding us. They were all armed, carrying rifles and shotguns. We were trapped. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, and my friends were silent with fear. "Let's go," I said, trying to keep calm. We started walking, but the men followed us, laughing and making threats. They fired their guns into the air, the sound echoing through the woods. We broke into a run, terror driving us forward. We stumbled through the dark, the men close behind. They seemed to know the area well, while we were tripping over roots and branches. My friend Sarah fell, twisting her ankle. I helped her up, but she could barely walk. "We can't outrun them," she said, tears in her eyes. "We have to try," I said, desperation in my voice. We could hear the men getting closer, their laughter ringing in our ears. We were running out of options. Suddenly, we saw a light in the distance. A cabin, or maybe a house. It was our only hope. We made a dash for it, praying that someone inside would help us. As we got closer, we saw that it was indeed a small cabin. I banged on the door, shouting for help. An old man opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. "What the hell's going on?" he asked. "Please, help us," I begged. "They're trying to kill us." He looked past us and saw the men approaching. "Get inside," he said, stepping aside to let us in. We rushed inside, and he slammed the door shut, locking it. The men outside banged on the door, shouting and cursing. The old man grabbed a shotgun from the corner and pointed it at the door. "Stay back," he shouted. "This is private property." There was a tense silence, and then the men outside started to back off. "We'll be back," one of them shouted. "And you better not be here when we do." We stayed in the cabin for the rest of the night, too scared to leave. The old man, whose name was Jack, told us we were lucky to have found him. He said the locals didn't like outsiders, especially not ones camping on their land. The next morning, Jack drove us back to town. We thanked him profusely, grateful to be alive. We reported the incident to the local sheriff, but he didn't seem too interested. "Best you don't come back here," he said. "Some folks around here don't take kindly to strangers." We left Texas that day, shaken and scarred by the experience. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't found Jack's cabin, and I don't want to think about it. I went on a hunting trip with my friends last fall. It was supposed to be a fun weekend in the mountains, just a bunch of us guys enjoying the outdoors. We set up camp near a dense forest and planned to spend the next few days hunting deer. The first day went well. We didn't catch anything, but we enjoyed the hike and the scenery. On the second day, I decided to go off on my own. I wanted to explore a bit and maybe find a good spot where the deer might be hiding. I told my friends I'd be back by evening and set off into the forest. I walked for a couple of hours, enjoying the quiet and the fresh air. But as the sun started to set, I realized I had no idea where I was. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing looked familiar. The forest seemed different, darker, and more confusing. I started to panic a little, but I kept walking, hoping to find a landmark or a path. That's when I saw the cabin. It was an old, rundown place, half hidden by the trees. I was relieved to see it, thinking I could ask for directions or at least use a phone. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The place was a mess. It looked like no one had lived there for years. There were old, broken furniture and dusty shelves. But then I heard a noise from the back of the cabin, like someone moving around. I called out, but no one responded. I walked further in, and that's when I saw him. A man, maybe in his 50s, with wild hair and a scruffy beard. He looked at me with cold, dark eyes. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough and angry. I tried to explain that I was lost and just needed help finding my way back to my camp. But he didn't seem to care. He stepped closer, and I could see a knife in his hand. "You shouldn't have come here," he said. "People like you don't belong in these woods." Before I could react, he grabbed me and threw me to the ground. He tied my hands behind my back with a rope and dragged me out of the cabin. I struggled, but he was strong and determined. He took me to a small shed behind the cabin and locked me inside. The shed was dark and cold. There was nothing in there but a pile of old blankets and some rusty tools. I tried to free my hands, but the rope was too tight. I shouted for help, but no one could hear me. I was completely alone. Hours passed, and I started to lose hope. The man hadn't come back, and I had no idea how long I would be stuck there. I thought about my friends, wondering if they were looking for me. I felt so helpless and scared. Just when I was starting to give up, I heard footsteps outside the shed. The door creaked open, and the man stepped inside. He had a sinister smile on his face. "Ready to go for a walk?" he asked, yanking me to my feet. He led me out into the forest, keeping a tight grip on the rope. I didn't know where he was taking me, but I knew it wasn't good. We walked for what felt like miles until we reached a clearing. There was a large hole in the ground, like a shallow grave. "Get in," he ordered, pushing me towards the hole. I knew if I got in, I wouldn't be getting out. I had to do something. I mustered all my strength and kicked him as hard as I could. He stumbled back, giving me a chance to run. I bolted into the forest, the rope still tied around my wrists. I ran as fast as I could, branches scratching my face and tearing at my clothes. I could hear him chasing me, shouting and cursing. I didn't look back. I just kept running, hoping to find help or at least a place to hide. Eventually, I saw a light through the trees. I ran towards it and found myself at a road. I flagged down a passing car, and the driver stopped to help me. I told him what had happened, and he called the police. They found the cabin and the man, but he was long gone. They searched the area, but there was no sign of him. My friends were relieved to see me safe, but the experience haunted me. I couldn't stop thinking about what could have happened if I hadn't managed to escape. I never went hunting again after that. The woods, once a place of peace and adventure, had become a place of nightmares for me. I still have nightmares about that man, his cold eyes, and the hole he dug for me. But I'm grateful to be alive and to have made it out of those woods. Alright, so I gotta share this wild ride I had as a rideshare driver. It was late, or should I say early, like the crack of dawn kinda early. Anyway, I get this request from some guy who wants to be dropped off in the middle of nowhere. Now, that's not exactly unusual for a rideshare, but something about this dude's vibe had me on edge from the get-go. So, I pick him up, and right away, I can tell there's something off about him. He's all jittery, constantly looking over his shoulder like he's expecting someone to jump out at any moment. I try to make small talk, to ease the tension, but he's not having it. Just gives me these short, clipped answers like he's got something to hide. We're driving for what feels like forever, and the whole time, I'm getting this sinking feeling in my gut. Like maybe I've stumbled into something I shouldn't have. Eventually, we reach this isolated spot in the middle of nowhere. No houses, no streetlights, just miles of empty road stretching out in every direction. I pull over, and that's when things start to get really freaky. The guy's acting all shady, like he's trying to hide something from me. He keeps glancing around nervously, like he's expecting trouble to come out of the shadows any second. I'm starting to regret ever picking this guy up, but I try to stay calm and professional. I ask him if he's sure he wants to be dropped off here, but he just nods, his eyes darting back and forth like he's trying to find an escape route. I let him out of the car, and as soon as he's gone, I peel out of there as fast as my wheels will take me. I don't stop until I'm miles away from that creepy spot, my heart pounding in my chest the whole time. I keep thinking about that guy and what he was up to. Was he involved in some shady business? Did he have enemies out to get him? Or was he just some paranoid nut job looking for trouble? I never found out the answers to those questions, and to be honest, I'm not sure I want to. All I know is, I dodged a bullet that night, and I'm damn grateful to be alive.